In the grim darkness of the far future, there are stories that slip through the cracks of history, tales so strange and improbable that even the Inquisition's most thorough chroniclers struggle to classify them. This is one such story. It begins not with the thunder of bolter fire or the whisper of political intrigue, but with something far more unsettling, the meeting of two impossibilities. On one side, a living relic from the dawn of the Imperium, a dreadnought whose censors once gazed upon the Emperor of mankind himself in all his terrible glory. On the other, a warband of Orks, those green-skinned manifestations of violence and chaos, whose collective belief can literally bend reality to their will. When these two forces collide, the result is something that defies easy categorization, something that reveals uncomfortable truths about faith, memory, and the nature of reality itself in the 41st millennium. The discovery. The world of Krathos Sigma had been dead for 3,000 years. Its once proud hive cities stood as hollow monuments to imperial ambition, their spires crumbling into the dust of ages, their forges cold and silent. The planet had been abandoned during the Age of Apostasy, deemed strategically worthless after a series of devastating Ork raids stripped it of resources and population alike. Since then, it had lingered in the void like a corpse floating in dark water, forgotten by the administratum, unmarked on most imperial star charts, a ghost world drifting through the eternal night. But Krathos Sigma had not always been worthless. During the Great Crusade, it had been a crucial staging ground for the expansion of the Imperium into the Ultima Segmentum. Its manufactorums had produced ammunition and armor plating for the Emperor's armies, and its training fields had birthed entire regiments of soldiers who would never see their homeworld again. More importantly, for a brief and glorious period, it had hosted several companies of the Adeptus Astartes, those transhuman warriors who carried the Emperor's will across the stars. Among those warriors was one who would outlive them all, though not in any way that could be called living. His name had been Brother Sergeant Thalric of the Storm Wardens, a veteran of 100 campaigns who had fought alongside his Primarch and, on 3 separate occasions, had stood in the presence of the Emperor himself. Those moments had seared themselves into Thalric's mind with a clarity that would never fade. He remembered the impossible radiance, the way reality seemed to bend and warp around that golden figure, the sensation of being simultaneously uplifted and crushed beneath the weight of infinite potential. The Emperor had spoken to him once, asking about the readiness of his squad for the assault on a Xenos stronghold. 3 words. The Emperor had spoken 3 words to him, and Thalric had carried those words like a sacred flame for the rest of his mortal life. That life had ended during a catastrophic assault on an Ork space hulk that had emerged from the warp near Krathos Sigma. Thalric's squad had been ambushed deep within the hulk's twisted corridors, overwhelmed by numbers that even space marines couldn't overcome. He had killed 17 Orks before the ceiling collapsed, crushing his body beneath tons of corroded metal. His battle brothers had retrieved what remained, finding his gene seed miraculously intact, but his spine shattered, his internal organs pulped, his nervous system irreparably damaged. By all rights, he should have been granted the Emperor's peace, and his name added to the chapter's rolls of honor. Instead, the Tech Marines had offered him a choice: death with dignity, or eternal service entombed within the cold embrace of a Dreadnought sarcophagus. Thalric had not hesitated. He had seen the Emperor. He had fought in his name. To refuse this opportunity for continued service would have been unthinkable. And so Thalric had died for the 2nd time, his consciousness uploaded into the neural interface of a Mark V Castroferrum pattern Dreadnought, his mortal remains preserved in suspensor fluids, while his mind became one with the machine. For 2,000 years, venerable brother Thalric had served the Storm Wardens, awakening to wage war and then returning to the dreamless sleep of stasis between battles. He had fought in campaigns across a dozen sectors, his assault cannon speaking death to traitors and Xenos alike, his power fist crushing everything from tanks to demons. With each awakening, he found it harder to remember what it had felt like to walk on two legs, to feel the wind on skin, to taste food and drink. But he never forgot the Emperor. That memory remained crystalline and perfect, a light that guided him through the darkness of his mechanical existence. Then came the final battle, at least what should have been the final battle. A splinter fleet of Tyranids had descended upon Krathos Sigma, drawn by some instinct that saw value where the Imperium saw none. The Storm Wardens had deployed to drive them back, and Thalric had waded into the swarm with the grim determination of one who has nothing left to lose. The fighting had been brutal beyond measure, the Tyranids throwing themselves at the Space Marines in waves that seemed to have no end. Thalric's chassis had been damaged repeatedly, his armor scored by acid, his weapons systems pushed to their limits. The killing blow had come from a Carnifex, one of those monstrous living tanks that the Tyranid hive mind crafted for breaking fortifications. Its massive scything talons had torn through Thalric's right shoulder mounting, severing his assault cannon and rupturing his primary power coupling. As he fell, his power fist had crushed the creature's skull, but the damage was done. His systems went into emergency shutdown, his consciousness fading as coolant and sacred oils leaked from his wounds. The Storm Wardens had been forced to retreat under the weight of the Tyranid assault, falling back to their strike cruiser and initiating an exterminatus protocol that scoured all life from Krathos Sigma's surface. In the chaos of the evacuation, Thalric had been left behind, his locator beacon damaged, his sarcophagus buried beneath tons of rubble in what had once been a grand cathedral. The Storm Wardens had mourned their loss, recording Thalric as destroyed in action, his name added to the litany of the honored dead. But Thalric was not dead. His sarcophagus, built to withstand the rigors of void combat and designed to protect its precious cargo at all costs, had weathered the exterminatus. His neural interface had entered a state of deep hibernation, his metabolism slowed to almost nothing, his mind drifting through strange dreams that were not quite memories and not quite visions. For 3,000 years, he slept beneath the ruins of Krathos Sigma, forgotten by the Imperium, unknown to the galaxy, a treasure beyond price buried in the ashes of a dead world. Until the Orks arrived. Warboss Gutslag the Collector was not a typical Ork, though he would have been deeply offended to hear anyone say so. Like all warbosses, he was massive, brutal, and enthusiastic about violence in all its forms. But Gutslag had a peculiarity that set him apart from his peers. He was fascinated by what he called shinies, artifacts and relics from other races that caught his eye and fired his imagination. Where other warbosses cared only about how much destruction a thing could cause, Gutslag wanted to understand how it worked, to take it apart and put it back together in new and interesting ways. This obsession had made him enormously wealthy by Ork standards. His collection of shinies included looted Imperial tanks, Eldar Wraithbone sculptures, Tau battlesuits, and even a few pieces of Necron technology that his mech boys swore would work proper once we figure out the buttons. Other Orks sought him out to trade for these treasures, offering teeth, scrap, and even portions of their own warbands, in exchange for access to Gutslag's hoard. Krathos Sigma had appeared on Gutslag's sensors as a world rich in salvage, its surface littered with the remains of Imperial civilization just waiting to be claimed. The fact that it was supposed to be dead made it even more attractive. No fight meant easy looting, and while Gutslag loved a good scrap as much as any Ork, he also appreciated the efficiency of taking what he wanted without having to break too many heads first. His warband had descended onto Krathos Sigma's surface in a fleet of ramshackle transports, their engines belching black smoke. their hulls covered in crude welding and bits of armor plating stolen from a dozen different sources. The Orks had spread out across the dead world's surface, their mech boys leading teams of Gretchen and boys to the most promising locations, places where their scrap-seeking instincts told them good loot was likely to be found. It was a particularly enterprising mech boy named Graza Iron Teeth who found the cathedral. He had been following traces of sacred oils and promethium that his custom-built sniffer had detected, hoping to find fuel for the warband's vehicles. Instead, he had discovered something far more valuable. Beneath tons of rubble, his digging teams had uncovered the intact form of an Imperial Dreadnought, its armor scarred but unbroken, its weapons systems dormant but potentially functional. Graza had immediately recognized what he had found. While Orks were not known for their subtlety or patience, they understood the value of heavy firepower. A Dreadnought was a walking weapons platform, a machine of war that could turn the tide of a battle with its firepower and resilience. More than that, it was a challenge, a puzzle wrapped in armor plating and sacred seals. If Graza could get it working, if he could claim its power for the warband, his status among the mech boys would rise dramatically. He had sent word to Warboss Gutslag immediately, knowing that such a find would interest the boss far more than mere scrap metal or fuel. Gutslag had arrived within hours, his eyes lighting up with unmistakable greed as he surveyed the dormant Dreadnought. This was exactly the kind of shiny he craved, a relic of Imperial power that could be bent to Ork purposes, a trophy that would make every other warboss in the sector jealous. "Get it out of the ground," Gutslag had ordered, his voice booming across the ruins. "And be careful, like. I wants this one in one piece, not all smashed up." The extraction had taken the better part of a week, Ork time, which meant perhaps 3 days by Imperial reckoning. The Gretchen had dug with frantic energy, motivated by the promise of extra rations and the threat of being thrown into the hole themselves. Slowly, carefully, they had uncovered more of the Dreadnought, revealing its full form piece by piece. The machine was magnificent in the way that only pre-heresy technology could be. Its armor plating bore the marks of countless battles, but underneath the scars was craftsmanship of a quality rarely seen in the 41st millennium. Every rivet was perfectly placed, every seam sealed with a precision that spoke to the hand of master artisans long dead. The Storm Warden's iconography was still visible on its chassis, the lightning bolt and storm cloud rendered in fading paint, but unmistakable in their meaning. What the Orks could not see, buried deep within the armored sarcophagus, was Thalric himself. The ancient warrior's consciousness stirred as his tomb was exposed to vibrations and movements for the first time in millennia. His damaged systems attempted to boot up, running diagnostic routines that reported critical failures across multiple subsystems. His power supply was nearly depleted, his weapons offline, his sensory arrays damaged beyond automatic repair functions. But somewhere in the depths of his mechanical mind, awareness was returning. Thalric could not move, could not speak, could not activate any of his external systems, but he could think. And in those thoughts, fragmentary and confused as they were, one thing remained clear. He had seen the Emperor. He remembered. And whatever was happening to him now, whatever forces were disturbing his rest, they would answer to the Emperor's judgment when his systems came back online. The Orks, oblivious to the ancient consciousness slowly awakening within the war machine, had begun their own work. They had hauled the Dreadnought to Gutslag's main base camp, a sprawling collection of scrap metal shelters and half-built fortifications that had sprung up in the ruins of an Imperial manufactorum. There, under Gutslag's watchful eye, the mech boys had begun their examination of this new prize. What makes this Dreadnought different? To understand the true significance of what the Orks had found, one must understand the nature of those rare warriors who have stood in the presence of the Emperor of mankind and lived to remember it. In the 41st millennium, such individuals are vanishingly rare. Most who claim to have seen him speak only of visions, dreams, or moments of spiritual ecstasy where they felt his presence in the warp. These experiences, while meaningful to those who have them, are filtered through layers of faith and interpretation, shaped by expectation and belief. But Thalric's experience was different. He had seen the Emperor in the flesh during the Great Crusade, when the master of mankind still walked among his armies and directed the expansion of human civilization across the galaxy. This was not a vision or a psychic manifestation. This was the real thing, the actual physical presence of the most powerful human psyche who had ever lived, standing before Thalric in all his terrible glory. The Emperor's true form was something that few could accurately describe, even those who witnessed it directly. His appearance seemed to shift depending on who looked upon him, reflecting their own expectations and desires back at them. To some, he appeared as a golden giant in ornate armor, a warrior king of impossible majesty. To others, he seemed an ancient sage whose wisdom was written in every line of his ageless face. Some saw him as a beacon of blinding light, too brilliant to observe directly, while others perceived something far more human and approachable. What Thalric had seen was something between all these forms and beyond them. He had perceived the Emperor as a being of layered realities, existing simultaneously as man, god, and something else entirely. There had been the golden armor, yes, but also an impression of vast psychic power barely contained within mortal flesh, of consciousness expanded to encompass possibilities that normal human minds could not grasp. Looking at the Emperor had been like staring into a sun that somehow also stared back, seeing everything that Thalric was and had ever been in a single instant. The experience had fundamentally altered Thalric's understanding of reality. He had carried the memory of that moment through 2,000 years of service, through countless battles and the transformation into a dreadnought, through periods of stasis that should have eroded even the strongest memories. But this memory remained perfect, crystalline, unchanging. It was burned into the deepest layers of his consciousness, preserved not just in his organic brain tissue, but in the neural engrams of his mechanical systems. This made Thalric's dreadnought chassis something far more than just an ancient war machine. It was a repository of knowledge from an age that the 41st millennium could barely comprehend. Within its databanks and neural matrices were impressions, memories, and recorded sensory data from the Great Crusade itself. The tech marines who had installed Thalric into his metal tomb had preserved everything they could, including fragmentary recordings from his helmet cam during those 3 occasions when he had been in the Emperor's presence. These recordings were degraded, corrupted by time and the limits of technology that was already ancient when Thalric had been interred. But they existed, somewhere in Thalric's systems, locked behind encryption that even he could not fully access, were actual visual records of the Emperor in his prime. Not artistic interpretations or faith-filtered visions, but real, objective data captured by military-grade recording equipment. The Adeptus Mechanicus would have killed to possess such information. The Inquisition would have declared it the most sacred relic of the Imperium, worthy of protection by entire armies. Even the Chaos Gods themselves might have taken interest, for knowledge of the Emperor's true nature was power of an incomparable kind. And now, through sheer cosmic irony, this treasure beyond measure had fallen into the hands of Orks, creatures who understood nothing of its significance and cared even less. But significance has a way of asserting itself, especially in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where belief and reality are far more intertwined than material science would suggest. Thalric was not merely a collection of data and weapons systems. He was a consciousness, a will that had survived 10,000 years through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender, and that consciousness was beginning to wake. The process was agonizingly slow. Thalric's primary power cells had depleted to critical levels during his millennia-long hibernation. His neural interface was running on backup systems that had never been designed for extended use, drawing trace amounts of energy from geothermal sources conducted through the ruins around him. Every thought required effort, Every attempt to access his sensory systems a struggle against failing hardware and corrupted software. But gradually, painfully, awareness returned. At first, it was just fragments, a sense of movement, vibrations transmitted through his chassis, the presence of organisms moving around, his sarcophagus. Then came sound, garbled and distorted through damaged audio processors. Voices speaking in a language that Thalric's recognition software flagged as Orkish, that brutal pidgin that passed for communication among the greenskins. Thalric's first coherent thought was confusion. Orks? Here? The last thing he remembered clearly was the Tyrannid assault, the feeling of his systems failing, the knowledge that he was about to die for the third and final time. Had he survived? How long had he been dormant? And why were there orcs crawling all over his chassis like vermin? The second thought was anger. Orcs were the enemy. They were Xenos, abominations that existed only to be purged in the Emperor's name. They had no right to touch him, to poke and prod at his sacred form, to defile the tomb that held what remained of his mortal body. Thalric tried to activate his weapons, tried to power up his assault cannon and scour these greenskins from existence, but his commands fell into the void of offline systems, unacknowledged and unexecuted. The third thought was something approaching fear, not for himself, for Thalric had long ago accepted that his existence was a kind of living death, but for what he represented. He carried memories of the Emperor, images and impressions that were sacred beyond measure. If the Orks somehow accessed his databanks, if they corrupted or destroyed those precious records, then something irreplaceable would be lost. The thought was intolerable. But Thalric was helpless. His will was iron, but will alone could not bring power to dead systems or restore function to damaged components. All he could do was observe, gathering what little sensory data his failing equipment could provide, and wait for an opportunity that might never come. The Orks, meanwhile, were having the time of their lives. For creatures whose entire existence revolved around fighting and looting, the Dreadnought represented the perfect combination of both pastimes. It was clearly a weapon, and a particularly shooty one at that, which meant it had value as a tool of war. But it was also a puzzle, a mystery wrapped in armor plating, and Orks loved nothing more than taking things apart to see how they worked. Graza Ironteeth had appointed himself the chief investigator of what the Orks were now calling the Big Matulgit. He had assembled a team of other mech boys and pain boys, Ork specialists, who dealt with machines and biology respectively. Together, they began a systematic examination of the Dreadnought, using methods that would have horrified any tech priest who witnessed them. They started by trying to pry open the sarcophagus itself, reasoning that if there was a pilot inside, they should get him out first. This proved more difficult than expected. The seals on a Dreadnought sarcophagus were designed to withstand everything from explosive decompression to the corrosive touch of Nurgle's plagues. Ork tools, no matter how enthusiastically applied, couldn't breach them. Frustrated by this failure, the mech boys turned their attention to the Dreadnought's weapons systems. The assault cannon was ruined beyond even Ork capacity for improvisation, its barrel bent and its ammunition feed torn away. But the Power Fist, that massive close combat weapon that could crush a tank with a single blow, was largely intact. Graza spent hours examining its power field generator, trying to understand how it worked and how he might replicate the technology for other Ork war machines. This close examination had an unexpected effect. As Graza's tools probed the Power Fist systems, they inadvertently completed a partial circuit in the Dreadnought's electrical grid. A tiny trickle of power, drawn from the portable generator that Graza was using to test the weapon, flowed into Thalric's dormant systems. It wasn't much. It was barely enough to activate a single subsystem, let alone restore the Dreadnought to full functionality. But it was something. It was a lifeline, a thread of energy that Thalric's desperate consciousness seized upon with mechanical precision. He directed that trickle of power to his most critical systems, bypassing everything else, focusing solely on what he needed most: awareness and communication. Deep within his sarcophagus, ancient circuits came to life. Diagnostic routines ran their courses, reporting the same catastrophic damage they had been reporting for 3,000 years. But now there was just enough power to run basic sensory processes, just enough to let Thalric perceive the world beyond his armored tomb. What he saw, through optical sensors so degraded that the image was more static than substance, filled him with renewed fury. Orks, dozens of them, swarming over his chassis like parasites, their crude hands defiling the sacred machine spirit that had been his companion for 2 millennia. They were cutting into his armor, removing pieces of his frame to examine the components underneath, treating him with all the reverence they might show a pile of scrap metal. Thalric tried again to activate his weapons, throwing every ounce of will he possessed into the command. Something flickered. The power fist's energy field crackled for just an instant, barely visible, but unmistakably there. The orc who was examining it, a smaller specimen who seemed to be Graz's assistant, jumped back with a yelp of surprise. "Boss!" the orc shouted, his voice carrying clearly through Thalric's audio sensors. "De Mertul git's got some zap left in him." This pronouncement caused considerable excitement among the mech boys. If the machine still had power, even a little bit, then it might be functional. And if it was functional, they could do so much more with it than they could with a dead wreck. Graza immediately ordered his crew to bring more power cells, to try hooking the Dreadnought up to external generators, to see if they could wake the machine spirit properly. For Thalric, this was both opportunity and danger. More power meant more capability, the chance to perhaps restore enough function to defend himself. But it also meant that the Orks might succeed in activating systems that were better left dormant, might access data that should never fall into Xeno hands. He was caught between his need for energy and his duty to protect what he contained. In the end, the decision was made for him. The Orks, with characteristic Ork subtlety, simply began connecting every power source they could find to Thalric's chassis, throwing cables across his frame and routing energy into any port that looked like it might accept a connection. Most of these attempts failed, the incompatibility between Ork and Imperial technology too great to overcome. But some succeeded, and the trickle of power became a stream. Thalric's systems began coming online in earnest. First his sensory arrays, giving him clearer vision and fuller audio. Then his communication systems, ancient voxcasters that could project his voice in a thunderous mechanical roar. Then, slowly and incompletely, his mobility functions, the servos and actuators that allowed him to move his massive frame. He was still far from full functionality. His assault cannon remained offline, its damage too severe for automatic repair protocols. His primary power cells were still depleted, leaving him dependent on the Ork's external generators. Large sections of his neural interface were still dark, either damaged beyond recovery or simply lacking the energy to reboot. But he could speak, and after 3,000 years of enforced silence, Thalric had much to say. The voice that emerged from the Dreadnought's voxcasters was like the grinding of tectonic plates, like the death scream of a dying god, amplified through speakers designed for battlefield communication. It was a voice that had not spoken in 3 millennia, and it carried with it the weight of all those silent years. "Xenos!" Thalric boomed, his volume cranked to maximum even though the Orks were mere meters away. "You dare defile the sacred form of the Emperor's chosen? You dare touch that which has stood in his presence and gazed upon his glory?" The Orks, to their credit, did not run. But they did stop what they were doing, their crude tools falling silent as they turned to look at this metal giant that had just decided to start yelling at them. For a long moment, there was silence in the workshop, broken only by the whir of cooling fans and the crackle of electrical systems struggling to stay online. Then Warboss Gutslag, who had been watching from across the chamber, began to laugh. It was not a nervous laugh or an uncertain one. It was the deep, booming laughter of an orc who had just heard something he found genuinely amusing. "Well, well," Gutslag said, striding forward to stand directly in front of the Dreadnought's forward sensors. "The big metal git can talk. That's proper orky, that is. Got some fight left in you after all." Thalric's targeting systems, running on pure instinct and muscle memory, locked onto Gutslag's center of mass. If his assault cannon had been functional, the war boss would have been reduced to a red mist in the next instant. But the weapon remained offline, leaving Thalric with nothing but words for weapons. "I am venerable brother Thalric of the Storm Wardens," he declared, his voice modulating to something closer to normal speech levels, though still tinged with mechanical distortion. "I have walked in the Emperor's light and fought in his name for 2 millennia. I have slain the enemies of mankind across 100 worlds, and I will not suffer my sanctified form to be profaned by Xenos filth." Gutslag cocked his massive head to one side, considering this pronouncement with the air of someone evaluating a particularly interesting piece of salvage. "That's nice and all," he said after a moment. "But see, we's the ones what dug you up. We's the ones what's gonna fix you. So seems to me like you's our metal git now, least till we figure out if we wants to keep you or sell you to someone else." This casual claim of ownership sparked fresh rage in Thalric's ancient heart. To be called property, to be treated as salvage by these Xenos monsters, was an insult beyond bearing. He strained against his damaged systems, trying to find some way to strike back, to show these orcs what happened when they challenged a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes. But his body would not obey. The connections were there, the pathways existed, but the damage was too extensive, and the power too limited. All he could do was speak, hurling threats and condemnations that the orcs seemed to find more entertaining than intimidating. And as Thalric raged, as he spoke of the Emperor's judgment and the cleansing fire that would surely come to punish this blasphemy, something strange began to happen. The orcs, listening to his words, started to believe them, not in the way Thalric intended, not as warnings of divine retribution to come, but in their own unique orcish fashion. Because orcs, unlike humans, do not filter their beliefs through layers of doubt and rational analysis. When an orc hears something that sounds impressive, that carries the ring of truth or power, he tends to accept it at face value. And Thalric, for all his fury, was speaking truth. He had seen the Emperor. He had fought in the Great Crusade. He was ancient beyond measure and powerful beyond normal reckoning. The orcs didn't understand the theological implications of these claims. They didn't grasp the significance of a living link to the Imperium's foundational era. But they understood strength when they heard it. And this metal git, this big, stompy machine that could talk and think and remember things from 10,000 years ago, was clearly strong. This perception, shared among the dozens of orcs crowding the workshop, began to feed into that strange psychic field that all greenskins generate, that gestalt force known as the WAG, and as it fed into that field, it began to change things in ways that no one, not even Thalric, could have predicted. Understanding orc psychology and looting culture. To comprehend what happened next, one must first understand the fundamental nature of orc consciousness and the reality-warping power of their collective belief. Orcs are not merely brutish fighters or primitive scavengers. They are, in fact, one of the most successful species in the galaxy, having survived and thrived for millions of years through a combination of biological resilience and psychic power that operates on principles entirely alien to human understanding. The orcs were created by the Old Ones, those ancient beings who fought the war in heaven against the Satan and their Necron servants. They were designed as soldiers, living weapons that could reproduce quickly, adapt to any environment, and fight with tireless enthusiasm. But the Old Ones, in their wisdom or desperation, built something into the orcs that made them far more than simple warriors. They gave them a collective psychic field, a gestalt consciousness that allowed individual orcs to tap into the mental energy of the entire species. This field, which the orcs call the WH, operates on a principle that would seem like magic to those not versed in the esoteric workings of the warp. When enough orcs believe something to be true, that belief has a tangible effect on reality. This is not mere superstition or coincidence. It is a measurable phenomenon that has been documented by Imperial scientists and Mechanicus tech priests, though they struggle to explain it in terms that fit their understanding of physics. The classic example is the Orks' belief that painting their vehicles red makes them go faster. By all conventional understanding of mechanics and propulsion, this should have no effect whatsoever. The color of paint on a vehicle's hull has nothing to do with its engine output or aerodynamic properties. And yet, when Orks paint their vehicles red, those vehicles demonstrably move faster than they did before. Speed sensors and tracking equipment confirm this. The acceleration is real, the velocity increase measurable. The explanation lies in the WH field. When an orc looks at a red vehicle and thinks, "That'll go faster," he's not engaging in wishful thinking. He's contributing a tiny amount of psychic energy to a collective belief that transcends individual consciousness. When thousands of orcs share that belief, when entire warbands accept it as self-evident truth, the cumulative psychic force becomes strong enough to actually alter the physical properties of the vehicle in question. This same principle applies to orc technology in general. By conventional standards, most orc equipment shouldn't work at all. Their guns are often little more than pipes with a firing mechanism, their ammunition rough chunks of metal that bear little resemblance to proper bullets or shells. Their vehicles are assembled from scrap with minimal understanding of engineering principles, held together by crude welding and pure faith. When a human tries to use an orc weapon, it typically fails to function properly, if it functions at all. But when an orc uses that same weapon, it works. The gun fires with devastating effect. The vehicle's engine roars to life. The electronics somehow manage to complete circuits that shouldn't exist. This is the power of the WH in action. Reality bending to accommodate orcish belief, because the belief itself has become a kind of power source. This understanding is crucial to comprehending what makes orcs such successful looters. They don't just steal enemy equipment and use it as is. They fundamentally transform it through their collective belief, remaking it into something that fits their understanding of how things should work. An Imperial tank captured by orcs might still look recognizable, but its internal mechanisms will have been altered in ways both subtle and profound. Its machine spirit subverted or replaced by something that responds to orcish expectations. The Death Skulls clan has elevated looting to a high art, developing a culture and belief system centered entirely around the acquisition and repurposing of salvage. They believe, with unshakable conviction, that blue is a lucky color, and that stolen equipment always works better than anything built from scratch. And because they believe this, it becomes true. A Death Skulls orc wielding a looted Imperial laser gun will find that weapon more reliable and accurate than its original owner ever did, simply because he knows it's superior by virtue of having been stolen. Warboss Gutslag der Collector represented this mentality taken to its logical extreme. Where other orcs might be content to simply loot and use equipment, Gutslag wanted to understand it, to collect it, to build a hoard of trophies that demonstrated his superiority as both a warrior and a thinker. His collection wasn't just for show. Each piece represented a conquest, a problem solved, an enemy overcome. And now he had added to that collection something unprecedented, an Imperial Dreadnought that not only functioned, but could speak, think, and claim to have seen the Emperor himself. To Gutslag and his mech boys, Thalric was the ultimate prize. He was a war machine of extraordinary capability, a repository of ancient technology that might be reverse-engineered or adapted for orc use. But he was also something more, a challenge. The machine spirit within this dreadnought was clearly active and hostile, resistant to Ork control in ways that most looted equipment was not. This made him interesting. This made him worth keeping. Grazza Iron Teeth, in particular, had become fascinated by the Dreadnought's power fist. He had never seen a force field generator quite like it, had never encountered power systems that could channel such enormous amounts of energy into such a compact space. The fact that the weapon had flickered to life, even briefly, suggested that it could be made functional again, and if he could figure out how the Imperial engineers had designed it, he might be able to build similar weapons for the warband's other vehicles and war machines. But Grazza's interest went beyond mere functionality. Like all mech boys, he possessed an intuitive understanding of technology that verged on the supernatural. He could look at a machine and somehow know what it needed to work, could see connections and relationships that existed more in the realm of psychic impression than physical reality. And when he looked at Thalric's Dreadnought, he saw something that troubled and intrigued him in equal measure. The machine was old, not just chronologically old, though it certainly was that, but old in a deeper sense. It carried the weight of history, the accumulated experiences of millennia of warfare. More than that, it carried memories. Grazza couldn't access those memories directly, couldn't read the data locked within Thalric's neural matrices, but he could sense them. They were there, vast and incomprehensible, a treasury of knowledge from an age that even the Orks understood to be significant. "Boss," Grazza said to Gutslag one evening as they stood before the Dreadnought in the flickering light of the workshop's torches. "This git's got something special in him, something big. I can feel it in me bones, like when we's about to find a really good fight." Gutslag grunted, his small eyes studying the inactive war machine. Thalric had fallen silent again, either by choice or because his limited power supply had forced another shutdown. "You think he's valuable, Dan? Worth more than just the metal and guns?" "I think," Grazza said slowly, choosing his words with unusual care, "that if we can get him working proper-like, if we can make him fight for us instead of against us, he might be the best thing we ever looted. But I also think he ain't gonna be easy. That machine spirit's a tough git, tougher than any I seen before." This assessment aligned with Gutslag's own instincts. The Dreadnought was special, that much was clear, but special things required special handling. Simply hooking it up to a power supply and expecting it to obey was clearly not going to work. They needed a different approach, something that took into account the will that dwelt within that metal shell. "Right then," Gutslag declared, coming to a decision. "We's gonna wake him up proper. Get all the juice we got, hook it all up, and see what happens when he's running at full power. Maybe when he ain't so weak, he'll be more reasonable-like." Grazza nodded, though he harbored private doubts about whether Thalric would become more reasonable with additional power. More dangerous seemed far more likely. But he kept these thoughts to himself. The boss had made a decision, and arguing with the boss was a good way to get your head squashed. Over the next several days, the Orks assembled an impressive array of power sources. They brought generators looted from Imperial facilities, power cells salvaged from their own vehicles, even a few pieces of xenotechnology that they didn't fully understand, but which seemed to produce electricity when activated. All of this was connected to Thalric's chassis in a web of cables and conduits that would have horrified any tech priest who witnessed it. The Orks worked with surprising care, following Grazza's instructions about which ports could accept power and which would probably explode if they tried. They reinforced the connections with crude welding, wrapped exposed wiring in insulating tape that they had stolen from an Imperial supply depot, and generally did their best to ensure that when they threw the switch, the Dreadnought would receive power, rather than simply catching fire. Finally, everything was ready. Gutslag himself stood at the master control panel that his mech boys had rigged up, one massive hand hovering over the activation lever. Around him, the entire warband had gathered, drawn by the promise of seeing something impressive. Orks of all sizes and clans filled the workshop, their voices raised in an excited babble of speculation about what would happen when the ancient war machine was brought back to full life. "Right den, boys," Gutslag bellowed, his voice cutting through the noise. "We's about to see if dis gets as hard as he says he is. Everyone ready?" A roar of affirmation answered him, hundreds of orc voices raised in anticipation. Gutslag grinned, showing a mouthful of metal-capped teeth, and pulled the lever. Power surged into Thalric's systems like a tidal wave after 3,000 years of drought. His neural interface blazed to life, systems coming online faster than they had in millennia, diagnostic routines running at speeds that his consciousness could barely follow. The sensation was overwhelming, almost painful in its intensity, like blood returning to a limb that had gone numb. For a moment, Thalric simply experienced it, the rush of returning capability, the feeling of potential that he had not known since before the Tyrannid assault. Then his tactical systems kicked in, assessing his situation with the cold precision of military programming. He was surrounded by orcs, his weapons were offline, his mobility was limited, and he was completely at the mercy of the Xenos who had restored his power. But he was awake, truly awake, for the first time in 3 millennia, and that meant he could fight. Thalric's optical sensors came online, giving him his first clear view of his surroundings since his fall. He saw the orc workshop, crude but functional, lit by flickering torches and the glow of forge fires. He saw the crowd of greenskins pressing close, their eyes wide with fascination and hunger. He saw Gutslag, standing at the control panel with an expression of smug satisfaction. And he saw, with perfect clarity, the opportunity to kill them all. His assault cannon was still offline, the damage too severe to be repaired by automatic systems. But his power fist, fed by the massive surge of energy from the orc generators, flickered to life. The energy field that could tear through tank armor blazed into existence, crackling with barely contained force. Thalric tried to move, tried to swing that massive fist and crush the nearest orc, tried to activate his mobility systems and wade into the crowd like the angel of death he had been designed to be. But his servos, dormant for so long, refused to respond properly. They stuttered and sparked, jerking his frame in spastic movements that accomplished nothing. The orcs, watching this display, began to laugh, not nervously or mockingly, but with genuine amusement. They were seeing the big metal git struggle like a newborn trying to walk, and it was, from their perspective, hilarious. "Easy there, big fella," Gutslag called out, his voice carrying across the workshop. "You ain't used to moving yet. Takes time to get your legs under you, especially after you've been sleeping so long." The condescension in the warboss's tone cut deeper than any weapon. Thalric was a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes, a veteran of the Great Crusade, a being who had stood in the Emperor's presence. To be patronized by a Xeno, to be treated like a malfunctioning piece of equipment, was almost more than he could bear. "I am not yours to command," Thalric grated out, his voxcasters crackling with suppressed fury. "I am a servant of the Emperor, and I will never submit to Xeno control." Gutslag considered this declaration, scratching at one tusk thoughtfully. "That's the thing, though. You keep saying you're the Emperor's git, but the Emperor ain't here, is he? We is. And we's the ones what can give you juice or take it away. Seems to me like that makes us your new bosses, least for now." The casual logic of this statement, the sheer audacity of it, left Thalric momentarily speechless. The orc was suggesting, with perfect seriousness, that power over one's energy supply constituted legitimate authority. By this reasoning, any enemy that disabled a Space Marine's armor would have the right to command him. But as Thalric's tactical systems analyzed the situation, he was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The orc was right, in a purely practical sense. Without power, Thalric was nothing but an inert mass of metal and ceramite. His will was strong, his purpose unshakable, but will alone could not make his weapons fire or his legs move. He needed energy, and the orcs controlled his only source. This was, he realized, a siege. Not the traditional kind, where armies surrounded a fortress and slowly starved it into submission, but a siege nonetheless. The Orks held the resources he needed, and they would only provide those resources if he gave them something in return. The question was what, exactly, they wanted from him. As if reading his thoughts, which was impossible unless the Orks had developed psychic abilities far beyond what was known, Gutslag stepped forward. "Here's what we's gonna do," the war boss said, his tone becoming more businesslike. "We's gonna keep you powered up right and proper. We's gonna fix your guns, get your legs working, make you all shiny and shooty again. And in return, you're gonna help us crump some gits what need crumping. You want me to fight for you?" Thalric's voice dripped with contempt. "You want a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes to wage war in the name of Xenos filth?" "Nah," Gutslag replied, shaking his head. "I want you to fight with us. Big difference. See, we's gonna fight anyway. That's what we do. But if you's with us, we's gonna fight better, harder, and we's gonna win more. And the more we win, the more loot we get, and the more loot we get, the more we can fix you up even better. Everybody wins, see?" This proposition revealed a certain pragmatic cunning that Thalric had not expected from an Ork. Gutslag wasn't asking for loyalty or subservience, at least not in the way a human commander might. He was proposing a transaction, an exchange of capabilities for mutual benefit. It was mercenary, crude, and entirely devoid of higher purpose, but it had a certain internal logic. "And if I refuse?" Thalric asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Gutslag shrugged, a gesture that involved his entire massive upper body. "Then we turns off the juice and you goes back to sleep. Maybe we takes you apart, sees what makes you tick, uses the bits for something else. Or maybe we just leaves you here as a statue, something to look at while we's working on other things. Either way, you ain't fighting, and that seems like a waste of a perfectly good me toolkit." The choice, such as it was, presented itself with stark clarity. Thalric could refuse, could maintain his purity of purpose and his rejection of Xeno authority, and in doing so, condemn himself to either destruction or an existence even more limited than his current state. Or he could accept, could fight alongside these Orks, and in doing so, gain the power and mobility to perhaps eventually escape, to find his way back to the Imperium, to report what had happened and warn his chapter about the threats that lurked on Krathos Sigma. Neither option was acceptable to his sense of honor. Both represented different forms of failure, different betrayals of the oaths he had sworn in the Emperor's name. But one offered the possibility, however slim, of eventual redemption. The other offered only stagnation and decay. "I will not fight in your name," Thalric said finally, his voice cold and formal. "I will not serve Xenos, and I will not betray the Emperor by lending my strength to his enemies. But neither will I allow myself to be destroyed without purpose. If our paths align, if your wars happen to target enemies that I would oppose regardless of your involvement, then I will act according to my own judgment and my own honor." It was a compromise, and Thalric hated himself for making it. But it was the best he could manage under the circumstances, a way to preserve some thread of his integrity while acknowledging the reality of his situation. Gutslag's response was unexpected. He laughed, not the mocking laughter of an enemy enjoying his captive's humiliation, but the genuine mirth of someone who had just heard something he found genuinely funny and somehow admirable. "You know what?" the war boss said, still chuckling. "That's proper Orky, that is. You're gonna fight, but you're gonna pretend it's for your own reasons, not 'cause we told you to. I can respect that. Shows you got proper spirit." He turned to address the crowd of Orks watching the exchange. "Listen up, boys. This here's our new..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Our new battle mate. He's gonna crump alongside us, but he ain't one of the boys. He's the Emperor's git, and he fights for the Emperor. We's just gonna happen to be fighting the same gits he's fighting, that's all." The crowd roared its approval, not because they understood or cared about the theological distinction Thalric was trying to maintain, but because their boss had made a decision, and it sounded like a good one. They would have a big metal git fighting with them, and that was all that really mattered. As the Orks dispersed to continue their various tasks, Grazza approached Thalric's chassis with a handful of tools and a determined expression. "Right den," the mech boy said, more to himself than to Thalric. "Let's see about getting dose legs working proper. Can't have you just standing there like a statue. That ain't Orky at all." And so began Thalric's new existence. Bound to a warband of Orks, by necessity, if not by choice, his ancient consciousness awakened to a reality stranger than any nightmare he had experienced in 3,000 years of service. He was the Emperor's warrior, trapped in circumstances that violated every principle he had ever held sacred. But he was also, and this thought came to him with bitter irony, still serving. Perhaps not in the way he had imagined, not in the glorious campaigns he had envisioned during his long sleep, but serving nonetheless. The Emperor protects, the saying went, and perhaps the Emperor had protected him for a reason. Perhaps this bizarre situation was not random chance but divine providence, a test or a mission that he was meant to fulfill. Or perhaps it was just the cruel joke of an uncaring universe, grinding on without regard for individual purpose or meaning. Either way, Thalric would endure. He had endured for 10,000 years. He would endure this as well. The WH40K field effect. Over the following weeks, as Graza and his team worked to restore Thalric's functionality, something strange began to happen. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable even to those involved, but it grew stronger with each passing day. The WH40K field, that collective psychic energy generated by the Ork warband, began to interact with Thalric's systems in ways that defied conventional understanding. Graza noticed it first. He was working on Thalric's mobility servos, trying to understand why they wouldn't respond to neural commands despite having adequate power. The problem should have been purely mechanical, a matter of damaged connections or worn components. But as Graza worked, tools in hand and diagnostic equipment running, he found himself knowing things he shouldn't know. He knew, for instance, that the servo on Thalric's left ankle needed to be rotated exactly 17 degrees clockwise before it would seat properly in its housing. He knew that the neural interface required a specific initialization sequence that wasn't documented anywhere in the Dreadnought's remaining databanks. He knew these things the way he knew how to breathe, with an instinctive certainty that came from somewhere beyond conscious thought. This was the WH40K field at work, though Graza didn't recognize it as such. All he knew was that the more time he spent around the Dreadnought, the more easily the repairs came to him. It was as if the machine was teaching him how to fix it, sharing its secrets through some unspoken communion. Thalric felt it too, though from a very different perspective. He noticed that systems which should have remained offline were flickering to life at unexpected moments. His targeting sensors would suddenly clarify, giving him crystal-clear images of the workshop around him. His audio processors would enhance, letting him hear conversations happening across the entire camp. Small improvements, incremental gains in capability that his damaged power supply couldn't account for. At first, he attributed this to Graza's competent repairs, but as the phenomenon continued and expanded, as systems began working that the mech boy hadn't even touched yet, Thalric began to suspect something else was at play. It felt almost like the WH40K field he had studied during his time fighting Orks, that reality-warping psychic force that made Ork technology function, despite all logic saying it shouldn't. But that couldn't be right. The WH40K field affected Ork equipment because Orks believed in it, because their collective consciousness shaped it to their expectations. Thalric was Imperial technology, sacred machinery, built by human hands according to principles that had nothing to do with Orkish belief. The WH40K shouldn't be able to touch him. Except that the Orks believed he was special. They believed he was powerful, ancient, significant. Gutslag had declared him a battlemate, elevating him in the warband's informal hierarchy. The mech boys spoke of him with a respect they normally reserved for their biggest and best war machines. And the regular boys, those simple-minded warriors who made up the bulk of the warband, had begun to see him as something approaching a lucky charm. Der Emperor's Git, they called him, using the title with a mixture of reverence and amusement. They would touch his chassis as they passed, the way human soldiers might touch a shrine for luck before battle. They would tell each other stories about how he had fought in the old days, back when the Emperor himself walked among men. The stories were wildly inaccurate, filled with Orkish exaggeration and misunderstanding, but they all shared a common theme. Thalric was special, and having him around made the warband stronger. This belief, shared among hundreds of Orks and reinforced through constant repetition, began to feed into the WH field. And the WH field, responding to that belief, began to alter reality to match the expectation. If the Orks believed that the Emperor's Git was powerful, then the field would make him powerful. If they believed his weapons were devastating, the field would make them devastating. If they believed he could fight with a ferocity that matched their own, the field would provide the energy and capability to make that belief manifest. Thalric, observing this process from within his sarcophagus, felt a mixture of horror and fascination. He was being changed, modified not by mechanical intervention, but by the psychic pressure of Orkish belief. It was a violation of everything he understood about the nature of machinery and consciousness, and yet it was undeniably happening. His assault cannon, for instance, had been irreparably damaged. The barrel was bent, the firing mechanism destroyed, the ammunition feed torn away. Grazza had looked at it and declared it unsalvageable, fit only for scrap. But the Orks believed that the Emperor's Git had a really shooty gun, because of course he did. How could the Emperor's chosen warrior not have a proper weapon? And so, impossibly, the assault cannon began to repair itself. Not through conventional mechanical processes, but through the reality-warping power of the WH field. Metal straightened, components realigned. Systems that had been dead for 3,000 years flickered back to life. It was gradual, taking weeks rather than days, but it was unmistakable. When Grazza finally examined the weapon again, he found it functional. Not perfect, not quite up to the specifications it had been built to, but working. He couldn't explain how this had happened, couldn't point to any specific repairs he had made that would account for the restoration. It had just fixed itself, like the machine spirit had decided it wanted to work again. Similar phenomena occurred throughout Thalric's chassis. His mobility servos, which should have required complete replacement, began responding to his commands. His armor plating, scarred and dented from millennia of warfare, somehow hardened, becoming more resistant to damage than it had been even when new. His power systems, running on Ork generators that should have been inadequate for his needs, instead provided more than enough energy for all his functions. It was as if the Orks' belief that he was a powerful war machine was actually making him more powerful. Their expectation that he could fight effectively was reshaping him into something that could meet that expectation. And Thalric, much as he hated to admit it, was becoming more capable because of it. The philosophical implications were staggering. If Orkish belief could affect Imperial technology this way, if their WH field was powerful enough to repair a Dreadnought through sheer psychic force, then what did that say about the nature of reality itself? What did it say about the machine spirits that the Mechanicus venerated, or the blessings that tech priests invoked over their equipment? Thalric had always accepted that there was a spiritual component to technology, that machines had their own kind of consciousness that needed to be respected and appeased. But he had understood this in terms of proper maintenance, ritual observance, and the careful preservation of ancient knowledge. The idea that belief itself could be a kind of fuel, that faith could literally alter the physical properties of matter, was something he had associated with chaos corruption or psychic sorcery. Yet here he was, being affected by exactly that kind of belief. The Orks thought he was powerful, and so he was becoming powerful. They thought his weapons were devastating, and so his weapons were becoming more devastating. Their crude faith in his capabilities was transforming him in ways that the most skilled tech priest could not have achieved. The worst part was that Thalric could feel himself changing in other ways as well. His thought processes, which had been slow and laborious in the first days after his awakening, were becoming sharper and faster. His tactical analyses, which had struggled through damaged neural pathways, now flowed with something approaching their original clarity. Even his memories, which should have been degrading after 3 millennia of storage, seemed clearer and more accessible than they had been in centuries. It was as if the WH40K field was not just repairing his mechanical systems, but also reinforcing his consciousness, giving him the mental acuity to match the Orks' belief in his ancient wisdom. They thought he was a wise old warrior who had seen things they couldn't imagine, and so he was becoming that, his mind sharpened by their expectation. This should have been a blessing, a return to capabilities he had thought lost forever. But Thalric couldn't shake the feeling that he was being corrupted, subtly altered in ways that went beyond mere physical repair. He was still himself, still remembered his oaths and his purpose, but there was something different now, something that hadn't been there before. He tried to resist it, tried to maintain rigid mental discipline and reject any changes that came from the WH40K field. But resistance proved futile. The changes were happening at a level too deep for conscious control, woven into the fundamental interaction between his systems and the psychic environment he now found himself in. And then there was the matter of his memories of the Emperor. These should have been sacrosanct, locked away in the deepest vaults of his databanks, protected by layers of encryption and religious prohibition. But the WH40K field cared nothing for such restrictions. It flowed through all barriers, touching everything, examining everything, absorbing information, and reshaping it according to Orkish understanding. Thalric became aware that his memories were being accessed, not by any deliberate act of hacking or data theft, but simply because the Orks believed he had important memories and the field was making those memories available. It was like his entire consciousness was becoming porous, his private thoughts and experiences bleeding out into the collective psychic space around him. One day, while Graza was working on his power fist, the mech boy suddenly stopped and looked up at Thalric's optical sensors with an expression of confused wonder. "I just saw something," he said slowly. "In me head, like a dream but clearer. There was this big golden git, biggest and goldiest git I ever seen, and he was talking to you. Couldn't understand what he was saying, but it felt important." Thalric's systems went cold. That was impossible. Graza shouldn't be able to access his memories, shouldn't be able to see his experiences as if they were his own. The barriers between their consciousnesses should have been absolute, maintained by the fundamental difference between human and Ork psychology. But the WH40K field didn't care about should or shouldn't. It cared about what the Orks believed, and they believed that the Emperor's git had seen the Emperor, had important memories locked away in his metal head. So the field was making those memories accessible, pulling them out of Thalric's databanks and projecting them into the psychic space where Orks could catch glimpses of them. "What you saw was private," Thalric said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Those memories are sacred, not meant for Xeno eyes." Graza shrugged, unconcerned. "Didn't mean to peek. It just sort of happened. But I gotta say, that golden git looked proper impressive. Is that what your Emperor really looks like? All shiny and big and bright?" The question cut to the heart of something Thalric had been struggling with since his awakening. What did the Emperor really look like? Every person who had seen him reported something different, shaped by their own perceptions and expectations. Thalric's memory showed one version, a specific configuration of light and form and psychic presence that had been filtered through his own consciousness. But was that the truth? Or had he, like everyone else, seen only what his mind could comprehend, a projection of the Emperor's true nature reduced to something a human brain could process? If the Orks, with their reality-warping belief, now had access to those memories, would they reshape them according to their own understanding? Would the Emperor, in Ork perception, become something different from what he had been in reality? The thought was terrifying. Thalric's memories of the Emperor were the most precious thing he possessed, the foundation of his faith and his purpose. If those memories were corrupted, if they were altered by Orkish belief, then what would be left of him? What would be the point of his continued existence? He tried to lock down his databanks, tried to erect new barriers around his most sacred memories. But the WH field was already inside his systems, woven into his very consciousness by weeks of exposure. There was no way to separate himself from it without completely shutting down, and even that might not be enough. Attempts at looting and awakening. The relationship between Thalric and the Ork warband settled into an uneasy pattern over the following months. Gutslag had been true to his word, providing continuous power and allowing the mech boys to make whatever repairs they deemed necessary. In return, Thalric found himself drawn into the warband's activities, though he maintained the fiction that he was acting according to his own judgment rather than following Ork commands. The first real test came when Gutslag's scouts reported the presence of a rival Ork warband on the far side of Krathos Sigma. This warband, led by a war boss called Skraga the Killer, had been stripping the planet's ruins for salvage, just as Gutslag's forces had been doing. Normally, the two warbands might have coexisted peacefully, each claiming their own territory and avoiding conflict until one grew strong enough to challenge the other. But Skraga had made the mistake of taking something that Gutslag wanted, a half-buried Baneblade super-heavy tank that both warbands had spotted at roughly the same time. Skraga's boys had gotten there first, claiming the massive vehicle and beginning the process of extracting it from the rubble. This was, in Gutslag's view, unacceptable theft. That tank was rightfully his, and he would crump anyone who said otherwise. War was declared with all the formality that Orks bothered with, which is to say, none at all. Gutslag simply assembled his warband, pointed them in Skraga's direction, and told them to go get his tank back. And because Thalric was now part of the warband, whether he liked it or not, he was included in the assault plan. "Here's how it's going to work," Gutslag explained, pointing at a crude map that his scouts had drawn in the dirt. "Skraga's got the tank surrounded with his best boys, keeping everyone away while his mechs work on getting it moving. We's gonna hit 'em from two sides, draw 'em away from the tank, and while they's distracted, you and me and the best fighters go right down the middle and crump anyone what gets in the way." Thalric examined the plan with his tactical systems, analyzing angles of approach and probable enemy dispositions. It was crude, but not entirely stupid. The diversionary attacks would split Skraga's forces, making them easier to defeat piecemeal, and a concentrated thrust by the warband's most capable fighters could potentially reach the tank before the enemy could reorganize their defense. "You want me to advance directly into enemy fire," Thalric observed, his tone neutral. "Dreadnoughts are resilient, but we're not invulnerable. Heavy weapons can still damage or destroy us." "Yeah, but you're a lot harder to hurt than a regular boy," Gutslag replied with a grin. "And besides, they ain't gonna be expecting an Imperial Dreadnought to be fighting alongside Orks. The surprise alone should be worth a few extra seconds of crumping before they get organized." This logic was sound in its way. Thalric knew from experience that unexpected elements in a battle plan could be devastatingly effective. An enemy who had prepared for one type of threat would be vulnerable to something entirely different. And he was certainly an unexpected element. More importantly, Thalric realized that this was an opportunity, not to escape, not yet, for he was still dependent on Ork power supplies and would shut down within hours if separated from them. But to demonstrate his capabilities, to show Gutslag and the warband what a proper Imperial war machine could accomplish. Perhaps if he proved valuable enough, he could negotiate better terms for his continued cooperation. "I will participate," Thalric announced, his voice carrying the weight of a solemn vow. "Not because you command it, but because the Xenos you oppose are also enemies of the Imperium. In crushing them, I serve the Emperor's will." Gutslag laughed at this declaration, as he always did when Thalric tried to maintain the pretense of independence. But he didn't argue. Let the metal git think whatever he wanted. as long as he fought when the fighting started. The battle began at dawn, if dawn had any meaning on a dead world with perpetual cloud cover. Gutslag's diversionary forces hit Skragga's flanks with all the subtlety of an avalanche, their guns roaring and their voices raised in the universal orc war cry of "Wag!" The enemy responded with equal enthusiasm, wheeling to meet these threats and pouring fire into the attacking orcs. While this chaos unfolded, Gutslag led his main force directly toward the Baneblade's position. Thalric strode at the center of this formation, his restored mobility servos allowing him to match the orcs' running pace without difficulty. The assault cannon on his shoulder had been declared operational by Grazza, though Thalric had his doubts about its reliability. The power fist on his right arm crackled with barely contained energy, ready to crush anything that came within reach. They encountered the first enemy resistance about halfway to the tank, a mob of orc boys led by a particularly large Nob, who was wielding a power claw that looked like it had been looted from a Space Marine Terminator. The Nob bellowed a challenge, his boys raising their crude shooters and opening fire. Bullets pinged off Thalric's armor, doing no more damage than rain against a fortress wall. He calculated firing solutions with the speed of thought, his targeting systems locking onto the enemy Nob with mechanical precision. Then, for the first time in 3,000 years, he fired his assault cannon. The weapon roared to life with a sound like tearing metal, shells streaming from its rotating barrels in a continuous stream. But something was wrong, or rather, something was different. The shells weren't following their expected trajectories, weren't dispersing in the pattern that Thalric's databases said they should. Instead, they curved in flight, drawn toward targets, with an accuracy that conventional weapons couldn't achieve. The Wag field was affecting them, Thalric realized with a start. The orcs believed his weapon was really shooty, and so the field was making it really shooty, guiding the shells with psychic force to strike with devastating precision. The enemy Nob barely had time to register surprise before he was torn apart, his massive body reduced to component pieces by the hail of shells. The orc boys, seeing their leader fall, wavered for just a moment. That moment was all Gutslag needed. He charged forward with a roar, his own power claw swinging in wide arcs that sent orcs flying. His best fighters followed, crashing into the enemy mob with overwhelming force. Thalric advanced behind them, his power fists reaching out to grab an orc who had been knocked down by the initial assault. He lifted the greenskin with ease, hydraulics and servo motors working in perfect harmony despite 3 millennia of disuse, and threw him into a cluster of his fellows. They went down in a tangle of limbs and weapons, and Thalric stepped on them as he passed, crushing bone and metal with equal indifference. This was what he had been built for. This was the purpose that had sustained him through 10,000 years of service. He was a weapon of war, an angel of death encased in adamantium and ceramite, and nothing could stand against him when properly employed. The battle raged for hours, the two warbands throwing themselves at each other with the kind of enthusiasm that only orcs could muster. Thalric fought with methodical efficiency, his assault cannon speaking death whenever he had a clear line of fire, his power fist crushing anything that came too close. He didn't tire, didn't slow, didn't feel fear or doubt. He was, in that moment, exactly what the Emperor had intended him to be. But he was also aware, in a way that disturbed him, that he was enjoying it. Not in the way a human might enjoy a challenge well met or a duty properly discharged, but in a deeper, more primal sense. The violence felt right, felt natural, felt like something he had been missing during his long sleep. And that feeling, that sense of rightness, was coming from the Wag field. The orcs around him were enjoying the fight, reveling in the violence and carnage, and their joy was bleeding into him through the psychic connection that the Wag field created. He could feel their excitement, their bloodlust, their simple pleasure in a good scrap, and against his will, against every principle he held sacred, he was starting to share those feelings. This was corruption of a kind he had never anticipated. Not the obvious taint of chaos, not the whispered promises of forbidden power, but something more subtle and insidious. The WH field was rewriting his emotional responses, making him more orkish in his reactions, even as he remained mechanically and intellectually distinct. He tried to resist, tried to maintain the cold detachment that was proper for a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes. But the field was too strong, too pervasive. It filled every corner of his consciousness, reshaping his experience of reality to match orkish expectations. By the time the battle ended, with Gutslag's warband victorious, and Skraga's forces either dead or scattered, Thalric found himself having to consciously suppress what could only be described as satisfaction. He had fought well, had killed many enemies, had helped secure the objective. By any objective measure, it had been a successful engagement. But successful wasn't supposed to feel this good. Victory wasn't supposed to produce this sense of fun. Gutslag approached as Thalric stood among the scattered bodies of the fallen, his massive form silhouetted against the smoke and fire of the battlefield. "Now that's what I call proper crumpin'," the warboss declared, clapping one huge hand against Thalric's armored leg in what was probably meant as a friendly gesture. "You fought real good, Metal Git. Real orky. I think we's gonna get along just fine." Thalric wanted to reject this assessment, to declare that there was nothing orky about his conduct, that he had fought with the precision and discipline of an Imperial warrior. But the words stuck in his voxcasters, held back by the uncomfortable awareness that Gutslag wasn't entirely wrong. Over the following months, this pattern repeated itself. Gutslag would declare some objective valuable enough to fight for. The warband would assault it, and Thalric would find himself fighting alongside the Orks, despite his every instinct screaming that this was wrong. Each battle made him more capable. The WH field continuously refining his systems and enhancing his combat effectiveness. But each battle also made him more orkish. He found himself thinking in terms that would have horrified him months before, evaluating situations based on how shooty or choppy they were, rather than using proper tactical terminology. He caught himself enjoying the mayhem, the chaos, the simple brutal joy of crushing enemies beneath his power fist. The Orks, for their part, had fully adopted him as one of their own. They called him the Emperor's Git, with genuine affection, painting crude representations of his Dreadnought form on their vehicles and armor. Some of the younger boys had even started imitating his manner of speech, trying to make their guttural orkish sound more like his mechanical cadence. Grazza had become something approaching a friend, though Thalric resisted applying that term to a Xeno. The mech boy spent hours working on Thalric's systems, making improvements that went far beyond mere repair. He had installed better power conduits, upgraded the assault cannon's ammunition feed, even rigged up a system that let Thalric interface directly with Ork communications networks. "You're the best project I ever worked on," Grazza confided one day while performing routine maintenance. "Most of the stuff we loot, it just sorta works, or it don't. But you're alive in there. You're thinking and remembering and getting better at fighting every time we go out. That's special, that is." This assessment troubled Thalric more than he cared to admit. He was supposed to be a prisoner, forced into cooperation by necessity. But Grazza's words suggested something else, a genuine connection based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The mech boy wasn't just maintaining a captured enemy asset. He was caring for something he valued, tending to it with the kind of attention that bordered on devotion. And Thalric, much as he hated to acknowledge it, had started to rely on that attention. He had begun to trust Grazza's instincts about what repairs were needed, to accept the mech boy's modifications without the resistance he had initially shown. There was an efficiency to their working relationship, a synchronization that came from months of close collaboration. This was how corruption worked, Thalric realized. Not through grand gestures or obvious temptations, but through small compromises that accumulated over time. Each battle he fought alongside the Orks was a step away from his original purpose. Each improvement Graza made to his systems was a thread binding him more tightly to the warband. Each moment he spent in their presence was another opportunity for the WH40K field to reshape his consciousness. He was becoming something neither fully Ork nor fully Imperial, a hybrid existence that shouldn't be possible but was happening nonetheless. And the worst part was that he couldn't see a way to stop it, couldn't identify a moment where he could draw a line and say this far and no further. The WH40K field was not something that could be resisted through will alone. It was a fundamental force, as inexorable as gravity or entropy, pulling everything within its influence toward alignment with Orkish reality. And Thalric, despite his ancient memories and his sacred purpose, was not immune. The Ancient's fury. The crisis point came during a raid on an abandoned Adeptus Mechanicus facility that Gutslag's scouts had discovered in the northern wastes of Krathos Sigma. The facility was old, dating back to the Great Crusade era, and contained stockpiles of archaeotech that the mech boys were eager to claim. But it was also heavily automated, its defense systems still active despite millennia of neglect. Gutslag had brought his entire warband for the assault, recognizing that this was too valuable a prize to approach with anything less than overwhelming force. Thalric had been assigned to the vanguard, his armor and firepower making him ideal for breaching the facility's outer defenses. The attack proceeded smoothly at first. The automated defense turrets were formidable, but predictable, their targeting protocols optimized for threats that had been relevant 10,000 years ago. Thalric and the Ork attackers made steady progress, destroying turrets and forcing their way deeper into the complex. Then they reached the inner sanctum, and everything changed. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows, its walls lined with data terminals and cogitator banks that still hummed with power. At the center, elevated on a dais, sat something that made Thalric's systems freeze with recognition, a perfectly preserved servo skull, marked with the sigils of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the personal seal of a fabricator general who had served during the Horus heresy itself. This wasn't just archaeotech. This was a sacred relic, a piece of the Imperium's foundational history, and the Orks, in their ignorance, were treating it like any other piece of salvage. "That looks valuable," Gutslag observed, gesturing toward the servo skull. "Graza, get that down and packed up. I wants it in me collection." Something inside Thalric snapped. For months, he had endured the corruption of the WH40K field, had felt his consciousness being reshaped by forces he couldn't control. He had fought alongside Xenos, had allowed them to modify his sacred form, had compromised his principles in the name of survival. But this was too much. This was not just any relic. This was a direct link to the era when the Emperor still led his armies, when the Imperium was united under his will. To allow it to be looted, to be added to Gutslag's collection of stolen trinkets, would be a betrayal of everything Thalric had ever fought for. "No," Thalric said, his voice carrying across the chamber with mechanical amplification. "This goes no further. That relic is sacred to the Adeptus Mechanicus. It will not be defiled by Xeno hands." Gutslag turned to look at him, surprise evident on his brutal features. "Now hang on. We agreed. We's lootin' this place together. You gets to fight, I gets to keep the good stuff. That was the deal." "The deal," Thalric replied, his weapons systems coming online without conscious command, "did not include the desecration of sacred Imperial relics. I may have compromised my honor by fighting alongside you, but I will not allow this." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. Orks, who had been happily smashing cogitators and loading scrap into bags, stopped what they were doing and turned to watch this confrontation. Some reached for their weapons, sensing that the fragile cooperation between their warband and the metal git was about to shatter. "You're really gonna fight me over this?" Gutslag asked, his tone suggesting genuine puzzlement rather than anger. "After all our battles we fought together, all the crumping we did, over one shiny skull." "That shiny skull," Thalric said, each word enunciated with mechanical precision. contains data from the Horus Heresy. It may hold strategic information, technical knowledge, even fragments of the Emperor's own orders. It is beyond price, beyond value, beyond your comprehension, and I will die before I let you claim it." The declaration hung in the air like a challenge, stark and uncompromising. Thalric knew he was provoking a confrontation he probably couldn't win. Gutslag's warband numbered in the hundreds, and while Thalric was formidable, he was still running on limited power and damaged systems. If it came to a fight, he would take many of them with him, but eventually they would bring him down. But some things were worth dying for. Some principles were more important than survival. And if this was to be his final battle, if this was where his 10,000 years of service finally ended, then so be it. He would die as he had lived, in defense of the Imperium and the Emperor's legacy. Gutslag studied him for a long moment, his small eyes calculating odds and weighing options. Then, to Thalric's surprise, the warboss began to laugh. Not the mocking laughter of an enemy about to crush a foolish opponent, but something that sounded almost like respect. "You know what?" Gutslag said, still chuckling. "I was wondering when your spine was gonna show up again. Been too long since you properly stood up for something. I was starting to think maybe the wag field had made you too orky." He gestured to his boys, waving them back from the dais. "Leave the skull where it is. The Emperor's git says it's important to his Emperor, and who am I to argue? We got plenty of other loot in this place. Don't need that particular shiny." The casual acquiescence caught Thalric completely off guard. He had been prepared for battle, had calculated firing solutions and planned his last stand. The idea that Gutslag would simply agree to his demands had not occurred to him. "You're allowing me to claim it?" Thalric asked, suspicion clear in his mechanical voice. "Nah," Gutslag corrected. "I'm letting you keep it safe. Big difference. See, way I figure it, if it's really as important as you say, then maybe someday it'll be worth something to Dal right people. And who knows, maybe those right people will pay good for getting it back. But even if they don't, having something that makes you happy makes you fight better. And I likes it when you fight good." This pragmatic reasoning revealed a cunning that Thalric had consistently underestimated. Gutslag wasn't just a brutal fighter. He was a leader who understood how to manage his resources, how to keep his warriors motivated and effective, and he had recognized that Thalric was more valuable as a willing participant than as a resentful prisoner. "I don't understand you," Thalric admitted, his systems still on high alert despite the apparent resolution. "You could take this by force. Your warband is large enough to overwhelm me. Why concede?" Gutslag shrugged, that massive gesture that involved his whole upper body. "'Cause fights like that are stupid. I'd lose good boys, you'd get wrecked, and in the end, I'd have a skull that nobody knows how to use anyway. Better to let you have your way on this one, keep you happy, and save the fighting for when we really needs it." The logic was unassailable, though it pained Thalric to acknowledge it. Gutslag had chosen cooperation over conflict not out of respect for Imperial relics or deference to Thalric's wishes, but because it served his own interests. It was manipulation, pure and simple, but manipulation so honest and straightforward that Thalric almost had to admire it. "The relic stays here," Thalric stated, establishing the terms clearly. "Under my protection. When I can, I will see it return to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Until then, it remains untouched." "Fair enough," Gutslag agreed. He turned to address his warband. "Right, your lot heard the man. The skull's off limits. Anyone what touches it gets to explain themselves to me, and I ain't gonna be in a friendly mood. Now get back to work. This place is full of good stuff, and we ain't leaving till we stripped it clean." The Orks, with characteristic adaptability, simply shrugged and returned to their looting. If the boss said the skull was off limits, then it was off limits. There were plenty of other things to steal, and arguing about it seemed like too much effort. Thalric remained on the dais, positioning himself between the servo skull and any potential thieves. Grazzer approached cautiously, tools in hand but expression uncertain. "You did good," the mech boy said quietly. "Standing up for what you believe in. That's proper, that is. Makes you more than just a weapon." This simple acknowledgement, coming from a Xeno who by all rights should have been Thalric's enemy, struck deeper than any grand speech or formal recognition could have. Grazza was offering respect not because he had to, not because the WAG field demanded it, but because he genuinely valued what Thalric had done. "Thank you," Thalric said, the words feeling strange in his voxcasters. When had he last thanked anyone, especially a Xeno? "Your support is appreciated." They stood together in silence for a moment. An ancient Imperial Dreadnought and an Ork mech boy, connected by months of forced cooperation, and something that might, under different circumstances, have been called friendship. Then Grazza nodded and returned to his work, leaving Thalric alone with his thoughts and his precious relic. The philosophical collision. In the weeks following the confrontation over the servo skull, Thalric found himself engaging in an activity he had never expected: philosophical discussions with Orks. It started when one of Gutslag's advisors, a particularly old and scarred knob named Kragger, approached him one evening as he stood vigil over the claimed relic. "Your Emperor," Kragger said, without preamble, his Orkish accent thick but his intention clear. "What's he like?" The question was so direct, so lacking in proper context or ceremony, that Thalric almost didn't answer. But something in Kragger's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than mockery. The old knob had fought in countless battles, had probably seen things that would terrify lesser beings. Perhaps he had earned the right to ask such questions. "The Emperor," Thalric began slowly, choosing his words with care, "is beyond mortal comprehension. He is power incarnate, wisdom made manifest, the pinnacle of human evolution. To stand in his presence is to understand both your own insignificance and your potential for greatness." Kragger scratched at one tusk thoughtfully. "Sounds a bit like our gods, Gork and Mork. Big, strong, always ready for a good fight, but they's also clever, see? Gork's brutally cunning, Mork's cunningly brutal. Together, they make us what we is." The comparison between the Emperor and the Ork gods should have been offensive, blasphemous even. But Thalric found himself considering it seriously. Both represented idealized versions of their respective species. Both inspired devotion and shaped behavior. Both existed as much in the minds of their followers as in any objective reality. "The Emperor is more than a god," Thalric explained. "He was, and perhaps still is, a man. He walked among humanity, led armies, built civilizations. His divinity comes not from worship, but from achievement." "Huh," Kragger responded, considering this. "So you're saying he earned it? Got big and strong through fighting and winning? That's proper Orky, that is. We respects that." This casual appropriation of the Emperor's achievements as somehow Orkish should have enraged Thalric. But he was beginning to understand that from the Ork perspective, anything admirable was Orky by definition. It was not an insult, but rather the highest compliment they could offer. More Orks joined the conversation over time, drawn by curiosity about this metal git who claimed to have seen his god. They asked questions both profound and absurd. What did the Emperor smell like? Could he crump good in a fight? Why did he let Horus almost win? Did he have any good jokes? Thalric answered as best he could, filtering his responses through the realization that these Xenos were genuinely trying to understand something outside their experience. They lacked the proper theological framework, the millennia of imperial doctrine that gave the Emperor's nature its proper context. But they were trying, in their crude way, to grasp something significant. What troubled Thalric was how easily he fell into these discussions, how naturally he began to translate imperial concepts into Orkish terms. He found himself explaining the Great Crusade as the biggest wag ever, describing the Emperor's psychic power as really killy psychic stuff, and characterizing the Horus heresy as when da Beskit went bad and tried to crump his boss. Each translation felt like a tiny betrayal, a reduction of sacred truth into profane language. But it was also the only way to make the Orks understand, and Thalric found that he wanted them to understand. Not because it would serve any strategic purpose, not because it would bring them closer to the Emperor's light, but simply because the knowledge deserved to be shared. The philosophical collision went both ways. The Orks, in their turn, tried to explain their own worldview to Thalric, teaching him about the WH40K field and its effects in ways that went beyond dry tactical analysis. "See, it's like this," Grazza explained one day while working on Thalric's power systems. "We's all connected, all the Orks everywhere. When we think something together, when we all believes the same thing, it becomes real. Not just pretend real, but actual real. That's the whack." "But that contradicts every principle of causality in physics," Thalric objected. "Reality cannot simply bend to accommodate belief. There must be underlying mechanisms, warp-based phenomena, that create the appearance of—" "Nah," Grazza interrupted, shaking his head. "You're still thinking like a humie. You're trying to explain it with rules and reasons. But the WH40K don't need explaining. It just is. We believes. It happens. Simple as that." This aggressive anti-intellectualism should have been frustrating, but Thalric found it oddly liberating. The Orks didn't waste time worrying about why their abilities worked or trying to fit them into existing frameworks. They simply accepted what was and used it to their advantage. "But doesn't that concern you?" Thalric pressed. "The idea that your reality is shaped by collective belief means you have no objective truth, no fixed principles to rely on." Grazza laughed at that. "Why would we want fixed principles? That sounds boring. The whole point of the WH40K is that things can change if we want them to. If a gun don't shoot good enough, we just believe it shoots better, and it does. If a vehicle ain't fast enough, we paint it red and believe it goes faster, and it does. That's useful, that is." The conversation troubled Thalric long after it ended. The Orkish approach to reality was fundamentally antithetical to everything the Mechanicus taught about the immutable laws of nature. Yet it worked. Demonstrably, measurably worked. The Orks' collective belief actually did reshape reality, creating effects that violated conventional physics. If Orkish belief could do that, what did it mean for human belief? What did it mean for the Imperial cult's worship of the Emperor? Billions of humans across the galaxy prayed to the Emperor daily, believed in his divine protection, had faith in his eternal guidance. Was that belief, that collective psychic energy, having any real effect? Was the Emperor's supposed power to protect humanity actually generated by humanity's faith in that protection? The implications were staggering and deeply uncomfortable. If belief itself was a kind of power, if consciousness could shape reality through collective will, then what was the difference between the Emperor's miracles and the Orks' WH40K field? Both relied on masses of believers channeling psychic energy toward a common purpose. Both produced effects that seemed to violate natural law. Thalric tried to discuss these concerns with Gutslag, seeking the war boss's perspective on metaphysical questions. To his surprise, Gutslag took the question seriously, settling into a philosophical discussion with the same enthusiasm he brought to planning raids. "The way I sees it," Gutslag said, gesturing expansively with one massive hand, "your Emperor and our gods ain't that different. They's both about making the people stronger, giving them something to fight for. The difference is, your lot forgot how to enjoy it. You're all serious and grim, fighting 'cause you has to, instead of a 'cause you wants to." "We fight because it is necessary," Thalric replied. "The galaxy is full of threats that would destroy humanity if left unchecked. There is no joy in such warfare, only duty." "And that's where you're wrong," Gutslag countered, his tone becoming almost pedagogical. "The fighting is the joy, the winning the crumping, the taking of loot from those what ain't strong enough to keep it. Your Emperor knew that, I think. He went out there and conquered whole worlds, took what he wanted, made everyone do what he said. That's proper Orky behavior, that is. But somewhere along the way, your lot forgot how to have fun with it." This critique cut deeper than Thalric wanted to admit. The Emperor's Great Crusade had indeed been a war of conquest, bringing unwilling populations into the Imperium by force. The rhetoric had always framed it as liberation, as bringing enlightenment and order to chaotic worlds. But from an outside perspective, from the view of those being conquered, it must have looked very much like what Gutzlag described, one powerful being taking what he wanted and crushing anyone who resisted. The Emperor's purpose was greater than mere conquest, Thalric insisted, though his certainty was wavering. He sought to unite humanity, to protect our species from Xenos threats and the dangers of the warp. Maybe, Gutzlag allowed, but he still enjoyed it, I bet. Nobody gets that good at crumping if they don't like it at least a little bit. And from what your memories show, he was really, really good at crumping. This reference to Thalric's memories being accessible through the vague field still troubled him, but he had learned to live with it. The Orks saw glimpses of his past, fragmentary impressions of battles and moments that had shaped his existence. They couldn't fully understand what they saw, but they drew their own conclusions from it. "You've been accessing my memories?" Thalric asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Not on purpose," Gutzlag clarified. "But when you're around us enough, when the wag field gets strong, sometimes we sees things, flashes, like dreams. I saw your Emperor once. In one of those flashes, he was..." The warboss paused, searching for the right word. "He was really big. Not just physically big, though. He was that too, but big like he filled up all the space. Like looking at him was looking at everything all at once." This description was surprisingly accurate, capturing something of what Thalric himself had experienced. The Emperor's presence had been overwhelming, occupying physical space while simultaneously existing in dimensions that normal perception couldn't quite grasp. "That is perhaps the most accurate description of the Emperor I have ever heard from a Xeno," Thalric admitted. "How did you perceive such details from fragmentary glimpses?" Gutzlag tapped the side of his head with one finger. "The wag field shows us what's important, what matters, and your Emperor mattered to you, so he matters to us. Makes sense, don't it?" In its own way, it did make sense. The wag field responded to significance, to emotional and spiritual weight rather than mere factual data. Thalric's memories of the Emperor carried such intense meaning that they impressed themselves on the field, becoming accessible to Orks who normally wouldn't care about human history or theology. This realization led to a disturbing thought. What if the Wagfield's access to his memories was actually changing those memories? What if the Orks' understanding of the Emperor, filtered through their own cultural perspective, was reshaping his recollections to match their expectations? He searched his databanks, pulling up the encrypted files that contained his most precious recordings. They were still there, still intact, showing the Emperor as Thalric had seen him during those 3 brief encounters. But something was different. The images seemed sharper than they should be, given millennia of data degradation. The audio was clearer. Details that he hadn't noticed before were now visible. The way field was restoring his memories, Thalric realized with growing alarm. It was filling in gaps, enhancing resolution, making the recordings more vivid and complete than they had any right to be. And in doing so, it was potentially adding details that hadn't been there originally, details that came from Orkish imagination rather than historical reality. He tried to determine which elements were genuine and which were WAG-influenced additions, but the task proved impossible. The field's alterations were too subtle, too well integrated into the existing data. For all he knew, his clearest, most detailed memories of the Emperor were now part Orkish fabrication. This should have been devastating, a desecration of his most sacred possession. But instead, Thalric found himself oddly accepting of it. The memories were changing, yes, but they were becoming more vivid, more immediate. The Emperor he remembered now was in some ways more real than the Emperor he had actually seen, enhanced by the collective belief of hundreds of Orks who had caught glimpses of that golden figure through the Waagar field. Perhaps this was what belief did. Perhaps it always had. Human memory was notoriously unreliable, shaped by expectation and emotion as much as by actual events. The imperial cult's image of the emperor had been refined through 10,000 years of worship, iconography replacing reality, until no one could say with certainty what he had actually looked like, or how he had actually behaved. In a perverse way, the Orks' influence on his memories might be making them more honest. They were adding their own perspective, their own understanding, creating a synthesis that combined Thalric's original experiences with Orkish interpretation. The result was something that neither human nor Ork could have created alone. The Emperor would not approve of this, Thalric said aloud, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to anymore. He would not want his memory to be altered by Xenos belief. Maybe not, Gutslag replied with a shrug. But he ain't here to say otherwise, is he? And besides, from what I seen in your memories, he was the practical sort. If he knew that sharing his story with us made you stronger, made you better at fighting, he might just think it was worth it. This pragmatic assessment of the Emperor's likely opinion was both presumptuous and uncomfortably plausible. The Emperor had been many things, but impractical was not among them. He had made alliances with Xenos when it served his purposes, had employed brutal methods in pursuit of his goals, had demonstrated again and again that he was willing to compromise principles for results. Would he have objected to Orkish influence on Thalric's memories if that influence made Thalric a more effective warrior? Would he have cared about doctrinal purity if abandoning it meant better survival odds for one of his servants? Thalric didn't know. He couldn't know. The Emperor was 10,000 years absent, his wishes and priorities unknowable except through the filtered lens of imperial doctrine. And that doctrine was itself suspect, shaped by millennia of political manipulation and religious fervor. What Thalric did know was that he was changing in ways he couldn't predict or control, and that those changes were being driven by forces he barely understood. The WH40K field had become as much a part of his existence as his own neural interface, shaping his thoughts and memories in ways both subtle and profound. The philosophical equilibrium that Thalric and the warband had achieved was shattered by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A Space Marine strike cruiser emerged from the warp at the edge of the Krathos Sigma system, its sensors immediately detecting the Ork presence on the planet's surface. The ship belonged to the Storm Wardens, Thalric's own chapter, though he had no way of knowing this at first. The cruiser's captain, a veteran named Brother Captain Tyrus, had been conducting a survey of worlds that had been abandoned during the Age of Apostasy. Krathos Sigma was on his list of sites to check, and the presence of an Ork infestation was noted as a problem requiring cleansing. Standard procedure would have been to orbital bombard the planet, eliminating the Xenos threat without risking ground forces. But the ship's sensors detected something that made Captain Tyrus hesitate. A power signature that matched Storm Warden technology, emanating from the largest Ork encampment. It was a Dreadnought's reactor, unmistakable in its frequency and output. Either the Orks had somehow captured intact Storm Warden equipment, which seemed unlikely given that Krathos Sigma had been abandoned for 3,000 years, or something far more significant was happening. Tyrus ordered a tactical reconnaissance squad to deploy to the surface, with instructions to investigate the power signature and report back. The squad, led by Sergeant Marius, descended in a Thunderhawk gunship, maintaining stealth protocols to avoid detection by the Ork warband. From his position in Gutslag's camp, Thalric detected the Thunderhawk's approach long before the Orks did. His sensors, enhanced by the WH field beyond their original specifications, picked up the distinctive energy signature of Imperial engines. His tactical systems immediately began running threat assessments and probability calculations. Space Marines, his brothers, coming to this world, perhaps coming to rescue him, or at least to investigate his presence. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the opportunity to escape his captivity and return to proper Imperial service. But even as these thoughts formed, Thalric felt a strange reluctance. He had been with the Orks for months now, had fought alongside them, had developed something approaching relationships with some of them. The idea of simply abandoning them felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The Wa-Ag field was affecting his loyalty, he realized with alarm. It was creating bonds where none should exist, making him feel connection to Xenos, who by all rights should mean nothing to him. This was corruption of the most insidious kind, rewriting his emotional responses to align with Orkish values of fellowship and shared combat experience. He needed to resist it, needed to remember where his true loyalty lay. And yet, when he tried to formulate a plan to signal the Space Marines and facilitate his rescue, his thoughts kept drifting back to what would happen to the warband if he left. Gutslag had treated him with surprising fairness. Grazza had worked tirelessly to maintain his systems. Even the regular boys had accepted him as one of their own, in their crude way. "Something's got you worried," Grazza observed, appearing beside Thalric's chassis with a handful of tools. "Your systems are all tense-like. What's wrong?" Thalric made a decision in that moment, one that he knew he would question for the rest of his existence. "There are Space Marines approaching. A reconnaissance squad, I believe. They've detected my power signature and are coming to investigate." Grazza's reaction was immediate and practical. "Right. We should tell the boss, get everyone ready for a fight. How long we got?" "Approximately 20 minutes before they reach visual range," Thalric calculated. "But Grazza, I need you to understand something. These are my brothers, my chapter. They believe I was destroyed 3,000 years ago. If they discover I'm here, they will attempt to recover me." "And would that be so bad?" Grazza asked, his tone surprisingly gentle. "Getting back to your own kind? We'd miss you, sure, but if that's what you wants." The implicit permission in those words struck Thalric with unexpected force. Grazza was offering to let him go, to not raise the alarm, to give him the chance to return to the Imperium. The mech boy was willing to lose his most interesting project, the prize he had worked on for months, simply because he understood that Thalric might prefer it. This was not how Xenos were supposed to behave. They were supposed to be selfish, cruel, incapable of empathy or self-sacrifice. Grazza's willingness to let him go contradicted everything Thalric had been taught about Ork nature. "I don't know what I want," Thalric admitted, the confession feeling like a weakness, even as it brought a strange sense of relief. "Part of me wants to go with them, to return to my chapter and resume my proper duties. But part of me..." He paused, struggling to find words for feelings he didn't fully understand. "Part of me has become accustomed to this existence, to fighting alongside your warband, to our conversations, to being something other than just a weapon." Grazza nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. "You're caught between two worlds, ain't you? Too Imperial to be a proper Ork, but too Orky now to be a proper Imperial. That's rough, that is." Before Thalric could respond, Gutslag's voice boomed across the camp. The warboss had spotted the Thunderhawk on his own sensors and was rallying his warband for battle. Orks grabbed weapons and rushed to defensive positions, preparing to meet what they assumed would be an assault by the approaching Space Marines. "Emperor's Git," Gutslag called, striding toward Thalric's position. "Dose are your lot, ain't they? Storm Wardens like what's painted on your armor. What do you reckon they wants?" "They want to investigate my power signature," Thalric explained. "They don't know I'm operational. They probably think you've looted a dead Dreadnought. When they discover the truth, they will attempt to recover me." Gutslag's expression became thoughtful, his small eyes calculating odds and considering options. "And what do you want to happen? You want we should fight 'em off, or you want we should let 'em take ya?" The directness of the question, the complete absence of any attempt to manipulate or coerce, was somehow more disarming than any threat could have been. Gutslag was giving Thalric a choice, allowing him to determine his own fate despite the potential cost to the warband. "I want," Thalric said slowly, "to speak with them, to explain what has happened. Perhaps there is a solution that doesn't require combat." This suggestion clearly puzzled Gutslag. "What kind of solution?" Dere space marines, we's Orks. Ain't much middle ground there. Nevertheless, I would prefer to try negotiation before resorting to violence. Will you allow me to make contact with them? Gutslag considered this for a long moment, scratching at one tusk. Then he shrugged, that characteristic gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and mild bafflement. You know what? Sure. Why not? Ain't never tried talking to space marines before. Might be interesting. But I'm keeping the boys ready, just in case. With Gutslag's permission, Thalric activated his external voxcasters and broadcast on standard Imperial frequencies. Storm Warden Reconnaissance Team, this is Venerable Brother Thalric, formerly of the 3rd Company. I am operational and conscious. Please hold your fire and allow me to explain my current situation. The response came after a moment of shocked silence. This is Sergeant Marius. Brother Thalric, our records show you as killed in action 3,000 years ago on this world. How is it possible you still function? I was interred in a Dreadnought chassis and left behind during the Tyrannid assault, Thalric explained. I have been in stasis for 3 millennia. I was recently awakened by salvagers who found my sarcophagus. He deliberately avoided mentioning that the salvagers were Orks, at least for the moment. Let the Marines come closer. Let them see the situation for themselves before he tried to explain the impossible complexity of what had happened. The Thunderhawk descended carefully, its weapons systems active but not yet locked on targets. It landed about 300 meters from the Ork encampment, and a squad of Storm Wardens emerged, their weapons ready but lowered in a non-threatening posture. Sergeant Marius led the squad, his armor bearing the honors of a veteran who had served the chapter for over a century. He approached Thalric's position slowly, his helmet's optical sensors no doubt scanning the surrounding area and noting with increasing alarm the presence of dozens of Orks. Brother Thalric, Marius said, his voice carrying the formal tone of military protocol, we are here to recover you and return you to the chapter. Please prepare for transport. It's not that simple, Thalric replied. I am currently dependent on external power sources. My own cells are depleted, and I require the generators that the Orks have provided. Marius's posture stiffened. You said salvagers. These are Orks. Xenos. What are you doing among them? Surviving, Thalric said bluntly. They found me, restored power to my systems, and made repairs that allowed me to function again. I have been cooperating with them out of necessity. Cooperating? Marius's voice rose slightly, betraying shock that his formal demeanor couldn't quite conceal. Brother, you cannot cooperate with Xenos. It violates every oath we have sworn, every principle the chapter holds sacred. I am aware of that, Thalric said, his own tone becoming defensive despite his best efforts. But I saw no alternative. Would you have preferred I remain dormant forever, my consciousness locked in darkness while the galaxy moved on without me? Gutslag chose that moment to step forward, placing himself directly between Marius and Thalric. The warboss was a full head taller than the Space Marine, his massive bulk making even power-armored warriors look small by comparison. This git's been with us for months now, Gutslag declared, his voice carrying across the tense space between the two groups. We's fed him power, fixed his guns, treated him right and proper. He's earned his place with us through good fighting and straight talking. If you wants to take him away, you're gonna have to go through me first. Marius raised his bolter slightly, a subtle warning that he was prepared to fight if necessary. Stand aside, Xeno. The Dreadnought belongs to the Imperium. We are reclaiming what is ours. Belongs? Gutslag laughed, though there was an edge to it now. He ain't property you get. He's a warrior, same as you or me. And warriors get to choose where they fight. Don't ya, emperors get? The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over Thalric's consciousness. Both sides were looking at him, waiting for him to declare his allegiance, to choose between his duty to the Imperium and his strange new existence among the Orks. The moment stretched, silence broken only by the whisper of wind across the dead planet's surface and the hum of active power armor. Thalric's tactical systems ran probability calculations. assessing the likelihood of violence and the probable outcomes of various courses of action. But this wasn't a decision that could be made through mathematics or logic. This was a question of identity, of who he was and who he had become. "Sergeant Marius," Thalric said finally, his voice formal and measured. "I request permission to address Brother Captain Tyrus directly. This situation is too complex to be resolved by a reconnaissance squad. I need to speak with someone who has the authority to make exceptional decisions." Marius consulted with his squad briefly, their helmet vox creating a bubble of privacy. Then he nodded. "The captain is willing to speak with you. I'm establishing a secure link now." A new voice came through Thalric's communications system, older and bearing the weight of command authority. "This is Captain Tyrus. Brother Thalric, I have reviewed the records of your service. You were a hero of the chapter, a warrior whose deeds are still remembered in our halls of honor. But I must understand what has happened here. How did you come to be among Orks, and why are they defending your presence?" Thalric took a metaphorical breath, gathering his thoughts before attempting to explain the inexplicable. "Captain, I was awakened by these Orks approximately 6 months ago. My power cells were depleted, my systems damaged beyond my ability to self-repair. They provided energy and performed repairs, allowing me to function again. In return, they asked that I fight alongside them against their enemies." "And you agreed to this?" Tyrus's tone carried disapproval, but also a note of genuine curiosity. "I agreed because the alternative was oblivion," Thalric replied. "But what began as a pragmatic arrangement has become something more complex. The Orcs' psychic field, their WH40K energy, has affected my systems in ways I don't fully understand. It has repaired damage, enhanced capabilities, and created connections that should not exist between Imperial technology and Xeno consciousness." There was a long pause before Tyrus responded. "You're saying that Orc belief has altered your Dreadnought, that their psychic field has integrated with your systems?" "Yes, Captain, and not just my mechanical systems. My consciousness, my memories, my very understanding of reality has been shaped by months of exposure to the WH40K field. I am no longer purely what I was. I have become something hybrid, something that exists between Imperial and Orc understanding." Another pause, longer this time. Thalric could imagine the captain consulting with his advisors, perhaps even with the ship's librarians, trying to determine if this constituted chaos corruption or something else entirely. "Brother Thalric," Tyrus said finally, "what you're describing sounds like xeno-contamination of your systems and consciousness. This is a serious matter that requires examination by our tech marines and chaplains. I am ordering you to submit to recovery and transport back to our ship for proper evaluation." "And if I refuse?" Thalric asked, surprising himself with the question. "Then you will have declared yourself rogue, and we will be forced to destroy you as a compromised asset," Tyrus replied, his tone carrying genuine regret. "I don't want that outcome, brother. You were a hero once. You can be again, if you allow us to help you." Gutslag had been listening to this exchange through the open Vox channel, and he chose this moment to interject. "Hold on, you metal git. You're telling me that if he don't go with you, you're gonna kill him? That don't sound very brotherly to me." "This does not concern you, Xeno," Tyrus responded coldly. "This is a chapter matter." "It concerns me plenty," Gutslag shot back. "That Dreadnought's been with us for months. We fixed him, powered him, fought beside him. He's earned respect from every Orc in this warband, and now you're saying he's got to choose between going with you and being killed. That's a pretty rubbish choice, if you asks me." "Your opinion is irrelevant," Tyrus stated flatly. "Brother Thalric, I am giving you one final chance. Return to the chapter willingly, or force us to take more extreme measures." Thalric's tactical systems screamed warnings. If he refused, the strike cruiser in orbit could simply bombard this location, destroying the entire Orc warband and himself along with it. Tyrus had the firepower to erase this entire problem from orbit, and from a purely pragmatic standpoint, that might be the cleanest solution. But something in Thalric rebelled against the idea of going meekly, of submitting to examination and probable destruction. simply because he had survived in an unconventional way. He had endured for 10,000 years. He had preserved memories of the Emperor himself. He had fought in battles that these young Marines could barely imagine. And he had learned, in his time with the Orks, that there were perspectives on reality that Imperial doctrine didn't acknowledge. "Captain Tyrus," Thalric said, making a decision that would define the rest of his existence. "I respectfully decline your order. I am not compromised by chaos. I have not betrayed the Emperor, but I have changed in ways that your tech Marines and chaplains would not understand and could not repair. I request that the chapter record me as lost with honor and allow me to continue my service in my own way." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of bolters being raised to firing positions. Sergeant Marius and his squad had clearly received orders to prepare for hostile action. "Brother Thalric," Tyrus said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "you are forcing me to declare you traitor. I had hoped to avoid this." "I am no traitor," Thalric replied, his voice rising with passion. "I have never served chaos, never turned from the Emperor's light. I simply recognize that there are truths about the universe that Imperial doctrine does not encompass. The Orks' WAG field is real, Captain. It reshapes reality through collective belief. And I have been touched by it in ways that make me more effective, not less. I am a better warrior now than I was 3,000 years ago, and that is worth something." "It is worth nothing if you serve alongside Xenos," Tyrus countered. The Emperor's vision was clear. Humanity stands alone, or it falls. There can be no compromise with alien races, no cooperation with those who would destroy us given the chance. Gutslag laughed at that, a booming sound that carried across the tense battlefield. "Funny thing is, we ain't trying to destroy you. We's just trying to loot your stuff and have a good fight now and then. If everyone would relax a bit, we could probably get along just fine." "Silence, Zeno," Marius snapped, his bolter now fully raised and aimed at Gutslag's center mass. "You have no voice in this matter." "Actually," Thalric interjected, "he does, because this is not just about me returning to the chapter. This is about what happens to the warband if I leave. Captain, these Orks have treated me with more respect and consideration than I had any right to expect from Xenos. They have honored our agreements, respected my boundaries, and fought effectively alongside me in dozens of engagements. To simply abandon them would violate my own sense of honor." "Your sense of honor?" Tyrus's voice carried disbelief. "Brother, you cannot have honor among Orks. They are Xenos. They have no concept of honor as we understand it." "With respect, Captain, I think you're wrong," Thalric replied. "I have observed Orkish honor for months. It is different from ours, yes, but it is real. They keep their bargains. They respect strength and courage. They value direct honesty over political manipulation. In some ways, they are more honorable than many humans I have known." This statement clearly pushed Tyrus beyond his capacity for patience. "Enough. Sergeant Marius, you are authorized to use lethal force if necessary. Recover the Dreadnought or destroy it. Those are your orders." Marius's squad began advancing, their weapons tracking between Thalric and the gathering Orks. Gutslag's warband responded by raising their own guns, preparing for a firefight that would leave many dead on both sides. "Wait," Thalric commanded, his voice amplified to maximum volume. "Both sides, hold your fire. Captain Tyrus, I propose an alternative solution." "I am listening," Tyrus replied, though his tone suggested skepticism. "You want to know if I am compromised, if the Ork influence has corrupted me beyond redemption. I submit that there is a way to test this. Send one of your librarians to examine me psychically. Let him probe my consciousness, assess the nature of the changes I've undergone. If he determines that I am tainted by chaos, or that my consciousness has been fundamentally corrupted, then I will submit to destruction. But if he finds that I am still loyal to the Emperor, still faithful to our oaths, then I ask that you allow me to continue as I am." The proposal hung in the air, unexpected and oddly reasonable. Tyrus conferred with someone off the Vox channel, probably his chief librarian. discussing the feasibility and risks of such an examination. "Very well," Tyrus said after several minutes. "I am sending Codicea Aldrich to the surface. He will examine you thoroughly. But Brother Thalric, understand this. If he determines that you are corrupted, if he finds even the slightest taint of chaos in your consciousness, we will destroy you from orbit. There will be no mercy, no second chances." "I understand," Thalric replied, "and I accept those terms." Another Thunderhawk descended from orbit, this one bearing the markings of the chapter's librarium. From its deployment ramp emerged a figure in blue power armor decorated with psychic wards and purity seals. Codicea Aldrich was a veteran psyker whose service record spoke of decades fighting the corruptions of the warp. He approached Thalric's position slowly, his force staff crackling with barely contained psychic energy. The Orks gave him a wide berth, sensing the power he wielded and recognizing it as dangerous in ways their simple weapons were not. "Brother Thalric," Aldrich said, his voice resonating with psychic harmonics, "I am going to enter your consciousness and examine your thoughts, memories, and spiritual essence. This will not be pleasant, but it is necessary. Do you consent to this examination?" "I do," Thalric confirmed. "Examine me thoroughly, Codicea. I have nothing to hide." Aldrich raised his force staff, channeling psychic energy through its ancient mechanisms. His consciousness reached out, touching the edges of Thalric's awareness, probing for weaknesses or signs of corruption. The sensation was intrusive but not painful, like having someone rummaging through personal possessions. Thalric felt Aldrich's presence moving through his memories, examining his experiences with the Orks, assessing the changes that the WH40K field had made to his consciousness. The examination lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Aldrich's psychic presence touched everything. Thalric's memories of the Emperor, his recollections of battles fought millennia ago, his more recent experiences fighting alongside Gutslag's warband, even the philosophical discussions he had engaged in with Kraga and Graza. Finally, Aldrich withdrew, his force staff dimming as he severed the psychic connection. He stood silent for a long moment, processing what he had discovered, formulating his assessment. "Captain Tyrus," Aldrich said, activating his vox, "I have completed my examination. Brother Thalric's consciousness is unusual. The WH40K field has indeed altered him in significant ways. His thought processes show elements of Orkish pragmatism. His emotional responses have been reshaped by months of exposure to their collective psychic energy, and his memories have been enhanced and in some cases modified by their belief." "Is he corrupted?" Tyrus asked bluntly. "No," Aldrich replied, and Thalric felt something that might have been relief flood through his systems. "He is not corrupted by chaos. There is no taint of the ruinous powers in his consciousness, no whispers of forbidden knowledge or demonic influence. What he has experienced is something different, something I have never encountered before, a synthesis of human and Ork consciousness, created not through deliberate corruption, but through extended exposure to psychic phenomena." "Can it be reversed?" Tyrus pressed. "I don't know," Aldrich admitted, "and I'm not certain it should be." "Captain, Brother Thalric's memories of the Emperor are intact and remarkably vivid. He carries within his databanks actual recordings from the Great Crusade, images and sensory data from occasions when he stood in the Emperor's presence. These memories are so valuable, so precious to the chapter's history, that they alone justify his preservation." This declaration seemed to shift the entire dynamic of the situation. Tyrus had been prepared to order Thalric's destruction if he showed any signs of corruption, but the revelation that Thalric carried irreplaceable historical data changed the calculus entirely. "Brother Thalric," Tyrus said after another pause, "Codicea Aldrich has declared you free of chaos taint. However, your current situation remains problematic. I cannot simply leave you among Orks, cooperating with Xenos against Imperial interests. That would set a dangerous precedent." What if I gave you my word that I would never fight against Imperial forces? Thalric offered. That I would use the Orks' resources to wage war only against enemies of the Imperium, chaos, tyrannids, hostile Xenos, but never against humans or Imperial assets. Gutslag made a disapproving noise at this suggestion. Hold on. You're saying you won't fight Humies even if Day's trying to crump us. That's going to limit our options quite a bit. Yes, Thalric confirmed. It is. But it's the only way I can reconcile my continued existence among you with my oaths to the Emperor. I will fight alongside you, but I will not raise my weapons against human targets. Gutslag considered this for a moment, then shrugged. Fair enough. We fights plenty of other things anyway. Chaos gits, space bugs, pointy-eared gits. Don't need to fight Humies all the time. Tyrus seemed to be wrestling with the decision, the weight of command authority bearing down on him. He could order Thalric's recovery by force, risking a battle that would cost lives on both sides. He could bombard from orbit, destroying Thalric and the Orks, but losing the precious historical data that Aldrich had discovered. Or he could accept this bizarre situation, allowing a Storm Warden Dreadnought to continue operating among Xenos, under the condition that he never fight against Imperial forces. Brother Thalric, Tyrus said finally, his tone carrying the weight of an irrevocable decision. I am making an exception to standard protocol. You may remain where you are, under the following conditions. First, you will never raise arms against Imperial forces. Second, you will make regular reports to the chapter about your activities and observations. Third, you will allow us to periodically extract copies of your databanks, particularly your memories from the Great Crusade. And fourth, if we ever determine that you have been corrupted by chaos, or that your continued existence poses a threat to the Imperium, you will submit to immediate destruction without resistance. I accept all those conditions, Thalric said quickly, before Tyrus could reconsider. Then you have my blessing, for whatever it's worth, Tyrus replied. May the Emperor watch over you, brother, and may we meet again in better circumstances. The Vox channel closed, and Sergeant Marius's squad began withdrawing to their Thunderhawk. The Space Marines cast backward glances at Thalric as they boarded, their body language suggesting confusion and concern about what their captain had just authorized. As the Thunderhawks lifted off and returned to orbit, Gutslag turned to Thalric with a grin splitting his brutal features. Well, that went better than I expected. Thought for sure we was going to have a proper scrap. Bit disappointed really, but I suppose it's nice not to have to rebuild half the camp. Grazza approached from where he had been watching the entire exchange. So you're staying then? For real? I'm staying, Thalric confirmed, and as he said it, he realized that it felt right. This strange existence among Orks, this hybrid identity he had developed, was now his officially sanctioned reality. He was still a Storm Warden, still loyal to the Emperor, but he was also something new, something unprecedented. He was the Emperor's Git, a bridge between human and Ork understanding, carrying memories of a golden age into a future that none could predict. Consequences and ripple effects. The decision to allow Thalric to remain with the Ork warband sent ripples through both Imperial and Ork society, though in very different ways. Captain Tyrus's report to the Storm Warden's chapter master was met with cautious acceptance, the value of Thalric's Great Crusade memories outweighing concerns about his unconventional situation. But the chapter master mandated strict oversight, assigning a dedicated inquisitorial observer to monitor reports from Krathos Sigma and assess whether this experiment in xenocooperation remained within acceptable parameters. Among the Orks, word spread quickly through the strange psychic networks that connected warbands across entire sectors. Gutslag the Collector had something that no other warboss possessed: a genuine Imperial Dreadnought, willingly fighting alongside his forces, blessed by his own chapter to continue doing so. This made Gutslag's warband incredibly prestigious in Orkish eyes, drawing ambitious young Orks from across the region who wanted to be part of something so gloriously unusual. The warband's size doubled within months, then tripled. Mech boys came from distant systems, hoping to study the strange synthesis between Imperial technology and the WAA field that Thalric represented. Weird boys arrived to examine the psychic phenomena, finding in Thalric a unique case study of how non-Ork consciousness could be shaped by the Gestalt field. Even some Ork philosophers, those rare greenskins who thought about things beyond fighting and looting, made pilgrimages to Krathos Sigma to discuss metaphysics with the ancient Dreadnought. Thalric found himself becoming something approaching a teacher, sharing his knowledge of Imperial technology, tactics, and history with Orks, who were genuinely interested in learning. He taught mech boys about proper power distribution systems, showing them how Imperial engineers had solved problems that Orkish technology typically handled through psychic force. He instructed tactical squads on Space Marine combat doctrines, not so they could use them, but so they could better understand and counter them when fighting against Chaos Marines or renegades. Most surprisingly, he found himself engaged in theological discussions that would have been impossible in Imperial society. Orks had no concept of heresy or forbidden knowledge. They asked questions that Imperial citizens would never dare voice. What if the Emperor had been wrong about something? What if Xenos weren't inherently evil? What if there were multiple valid paths to truth? These discussions forced Thalric to examine assumptions he had never questioned before. He discovered, to his discomfort, that he couldn't always defend Imperial doctrine with the certainty he once had. The Emperor's vision of human supremacy made less sense when one was living proof that human and Xeno consciousness could coexist and even enhance each other. The prohibition against alien contact seemed arbitrary when one had fought effectively alongside Orks for months without suffering corruption. The WAA field continued to affect Thalric in subtle ways. His combat capabilities increased far beyond what his original specifications allowed. His assault cannon, once merely dangerous, became legendary in its accuracy and destructive power. His armor plating, enhanced by Orkish belief in his invulnerability, shrugged off hits that should have penetrated. His tactical acumen, sharpened by both his ancient experience and the collective cunning of the warband, made him an invaluable strategic asset. But the changes went deeper than mere combat effectiveness. Thalric found himself genuinely enjoying the company of certain Orks, looking forward to conversations with Grazza about engineering problems or philosophical debates with Kragger about the nature of divinity. He developed what could only be called affection for some of the younger Orks who had appointed themselves his informal honor guard, protecting his position during battles and ensuring his power supply remained stable. This emotional connection to Xenos should have troubled him more than it did. By all rights, he should have been constantly fighting against these feelings, maintaining rigid psychological barriers between himself and his alien companions. But the WAG field made such resistance futile. It wove connections at a level deeper than conscious choice, creating bonds that felt as natural and inevitable as gravity. The servo skull he had claimed from the Mechanicus facility remained under his protection, its data still encrypted and inaccessible. Thalric made regular attempts to break the encryption, hoping to discover what information it contained. But the security protocols were beyond even his enhanced capabilities. He suspected that full access would require resources available only to the Adeptus Mechanicus, which meant he would need to eventually find a way to return it to Imperial custody. This goal became a focus for the warband's activities. Gutzlag, recognizing that Thalric valued the relic highly, began directing raids toward targets that might yield technical expertise or equipment useful for decryption. They attacked abandoned research facilities, looted data repositories, even raided a small Mechanicus outpost where Thalric carefully ensured that all the tech priests survived and were left unharmed, much to the Orcs' confusion. "I don't get why we can't just crump them and take their stuff," one Orc complained after they had withdrawn from the outpost with minimal violence. "Because those tech priests are the Emperor's servants," Thalric explained patiently. "They maintain the sacred machines that keep the Imperium functioning. Killing them would be the same as killing Imperial soldiers or citizens. I will not permit it. This adherence to his oath not to harm Imperial forces sometimes put him at odds with the warband, but Gutslag had learned to work within these constraints. The warboss directed his boys towards Xeno targets and Chaos forces, keeping them busy with battles that Thalric could participate in without violating his principles. One particularly significant engagement came when they encountered a Chaos warband led by a fallen Dreadnought, a thing of twisted metal and demonic corruption that had once been a noble warrior. The sight of what he could have become had he fallen to Chaos rather than to Orc influence struck Thalric with profound horror. The battle was brutal, Thalric engaging his corrupted counterpart in single combat, while the Orcs fought against the Chaos Marines surrounding them. The fallen Dreadnought wielded powers born of the warp, reality warping abilities that should have given it overwhelming advantage. But Thalric had the WH40K field on his side, and the Orcs' collective belief in his strength made him powerful enough to match the demon-enhanced war machine. When Thalric's power fist finally crushed the corrupted Dreadnought's sarcophagus, spilling the diseased remnants of its pilot onto the ground, he felt something like vindication. This could have been his fate. This corruption, this damnation, was what would have happened if he had chosen differently at any of the critical junctures in his strange journey. But he had not chosen that path. He had chosen to survive, to adapt, to find honor in circumstances that Imperial doctrine said should contain none. And in doing so, he had remained pure in ways that the corrupted Dreadnought had not. The Orcs celebrated the victory with their characteristic enthusiasm, declaring Thalric the bestest metal git in the whole galaxy, and painting elaborate murals of the battle on their vehicles. Grazza insisted on mounting pieces of the fallen Dreadnought's armor on Thalric's chassis as trophies, creating a visible record of his triumph over corruption. As months turned into years, Thalric's existence settled into a pattern that, while bizarre by Imperial standards, worked effectively for all involved. He fought alongside the Orcs against threats to both their interests, carefully avoiding any conflict with Imperial forces. He shared his knowledge with those who sought to learn, becoming an unexpected source of education for Orcs who might otherwise never understand human thinking. And he protected his precious relic, that servo skull whose secrets remained locked away, a mystery awaiting eventual resolution. The Storm Wardens sent representatives periodically to extract copies of his databanks, particularly his memories of the Emperor. These sessions were awkward affairs, Tech Marines and chaplains clearly uncomfortable with recovering sacred information from a Dreadnought living among Xenos. But they completed their tasks professionally, recognizing the value of what Thalric preserved. During one such extraction, a young chaplain named Cassius asked Thalric a question that cut to the heart of his unusual existence. "Brother, do you ever regret your choice? Do you wish you had returned to the chapter when you had the chance?" Thalric considered the question carefully before responding. "I regret that circumstances forced such a choice upon me. I regret that I could not serve the Emperor in the traditional way, surrounded by brothers who share my oaths and my purpose. But do I regret surviving? Do I regret finding a path forward even when that path violated every expectation? No, chaplain, I do not regret that. Even though it means living among Xenos, even though it means being changed by their influence. Especially because of that," Thalric replied. "I have learned things here that I could never have learned within the chapter. I have seen that reality is more complex than our doctrines suggest, that there are truths we have not acknowledged and possibilities we have not explored. These lessons may serve the Imperium well someday, if anyone can bring themselves to listen." Cassius recorded this response without comment, but Thalric could sense the young chaplain's discomfort. These were not words that fit easily within Imperial theology. They suggested flexibility, where dogma demanded rigidity, acknowledged complexity, where doctrine preferred simplicity, but they were true. And truth, Thalric had discovered, was worth preserving, even when it made others uncomfortable. The twisted outcome, the final transformation of Thalric's strange existence, came during what the Orks called the Great Crumpin of the Purple Gits, a massive campaign against an Eldar craft world that had made the mistake of raiding Ork territory. Gutslag had assembled the largest WAGR that Krathos Sigma had seen in decades, drawing warbands from across 3 sectors for a united assault on the craft world. Thalric had objected to this campaign initially, arguing that attacking the Eldar unprovoked violated the spirit of his oath to fight only in defense against enemies of humanity. But Gutslag pointed out that the Eldar had fired the first shot, making this a defensive war from the Ork perspective. It was a technicality, but one that Thalric found himself accepting. The assault on the craft world was unlike anything Thalric had experienced, even in his ancient memories of the Great Crusade. The Eldar fought with a grace and precision that made even Space Marine tactics seem crude by comparison. Their weapons harvested souls, their vehicles moved faster than thought, their psykers wielded powers that made reality itself seem negotiable. But the Orks countered all of this with sheer overwhelming force and the reality-warping power of the WAGR field. Millions of greenskins descended on the craft world, their belief in victory so strong that it began to manifest as actual probability shifts. Impossible shots connected, last-minute rescues occurred with suspicious frequency, and Ork equipment that should have failed continued functioning through pure, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Thalric found himself at the center of the largest concentration of WAGR energy he had ever experienced. With millions of Orks nearby, all focused on the same goal, the psychic field became almost tangible. He could feel it flowing through his systems, enhancing every function, pushing his capabilities to limits that should have been impossible. His assault cannon fired shells that curved around obstacles to strike targets he couldn't see directly. His power fist's energy field expanded to 3 times its normal size, allowing him to crush entire squads with single blows. His armor became so resistant to damage that Eldar bright lances, weapons capable of melting through tank plating, left barely visible scorch marks on his hull. He was not just fighting. He was becoming a manifestation of the WAG itself, a focus point for the collective belief of millions of Orks who thought he was the toughest, shootiest, most unstoppable warrior in the galaxy. And because they believed it with such absolute conviction, it was becoming true. The experience was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Thalric felt his consciousness expanding, touching minds across the entire battlefield, understanding the flow of combat at a level that transcended mere tactical analysis. He could predict what the Eldar would do, not because he had calculated their likely strategies, but because he simply knew, with the certainty that the WAGH field provided to those it touched most deeply. In the heart of the craft world, Thalric encountered an Eldar Wraithlord, one of those massive constructs that housed the souls of their ancient dead. It was in some ways similar to his own existence, a consciousness preserved within a war machine forced to fight for eternity. The parallel was not lost on either combatant. "You are an abomination," the Wraithlord declared, its voice carrying psychic overtones that bypassed Thalric's audio sensors and spoke directly to his mind. A human consciousness corrupted by Orkish psychic pollution, neither one thing nor the other. You should not exist. "I could say the same of you," Thalric replied, circling the Wraithlord as they sought advantage. "A soul that should have passed to whatever afterlife your people believe in, instead trapped in metal and forced to witness ages you were not meant to see. We are both unnatural by our species' standards." "But I serve a purpose higher than mere survival," the Wraithlord countered. "I protect my craft world, preserve my people's knowledge, guide the living with my ancient wisdom. You serve Xenos, who will discard you the moment you cease to be useful." This accusation struck deeper than the Wraithlord probably intended. Was it true? Were the Orks simply using him, tolerating his presence for as long as it benefited them? Would Gutslag abandon him if he became more burden than asset? But even as these doubts formed, Thalric felt the answer through the WAG field. The Orks' acceptance of him was not pragmatic calculation. It was genuine, rooted in their simple but powerful sense of fellowship. They valued him not just for what he could do, but for who he was, for the stories he told, and the perspectives he offered. They had made him one of their own in ways that transcended mere utility. "You're wrong," Thalric said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "They will not discard me, because I am not their tool. I am their brother in arms, their battlemate, their friend. And those are bonds that orcs take seriously, perhaps more seriously than humans do." The battle with the Wraithlord was brief but intense. Two ancient warriors throwing everything they had at each other in a contest that neither could afford to lose. In the end, Thalric's WH40K-enhanced power proved superior. His power fist shattered the Wraithlord's chest plating, destroying the spirit stone that housed its ancient soul. As the Wraithlord fell, its consciousness dissolving into the psychic medium of the craft world, it sent one final thought to Thalric. "You have become what you never intended to be. I hope, for your sake, that it was worth the cost." The words haunted Thalric long after the battle ended, long after the orcs had looted the craft world and celebrated their victory with characteristic exuberance. He had indeed become something he never intended to be. He was no longer purely a storm warden, no longer entirely human in his consciousness. The WH40K had reshaped him so thoroughly that he could not separate what he had been from what he had become. But was that necessarily bad? The Imperial view would say yes, that any deviation from prescribed forms was dangerous and potentially heretical. But Thalric had seen too much, learned too much, to accept that rigid perspective anymore. He had become something new, something unprecedented, and that newness had value precisely because it challenged assumptions about what was possible. The greatest irony was that his memories of the Emperor, those precious recordings that the Storm Wardens so desperately wanted to preserve, had become clearer and more detailed through Orkish influence. The WH40K field had enhanced them, filling in gaps and sharpening resolution in ways that human technology could not match. The Emperor's image in Thalric's memory banks was now in some sense more Orkish than human, seen through the lens of greenskin understanding. And yet, it felt more accurate somehow. The Orks saw the Emperor not as a distant divine figure, but as the biggest, toughest, smartest git who had ever lived. A being of unmatched power who had conquered the galaxy through sheer force of will. This was crude theology by Imperial standards, but it captured something essential about the Emperor's nature that millennia of religious refinement had obscured. The Emperor had been a conqueror. He had been brutal when necessary, pragmatic when useful, willing to compromise principles for results. The Orks understood this instinctively, while the Imperium had spent 10,000 years trying to pretend otherwise. Closing. Legacy. Years passed on Krathos Sigma, that dead world that had become unexpectedly alive with purpose. Gutslag's warband grew into a permanent settlement, a bizarre hybrid of Ork culture and Imperial influence. The mech boys built workshops using techniques they had learned from Thalric, producing equipment that was shockingly reliable by Ork standards. The Pain Boys consulted his medical databanks to improve their understanding of human physiology, which made them better at fighting and looting space marines. Thalric himself became a legend, not just among the Orks, but in wider Imperial society. Stories spread of the ancient Dreadnought, who lived among Xenos, the Emperor's Git, who fought with greenskins against the forces of chaos. Inquisitors debated whether this represented dangerous precedent or valuable intelligence. Tech priests argued about whether the WH40K field's influence on his systems constituted tech heresy or revolutionary breakthrough. The Storm Wardens continued to extract his memories, building a comprehensive archive of Great Crusade history based on his recordings. Scholars across the Imperium studied these memories, gaining insights into an era that had been lost to legend. Some noticed elements that seemed unusual, perspectives that didn't quite match other historical records. These anomalies were attributed to data corruption, though Thalric knew they came from Orkish influence reshaping his recollections. He never told them the truth. Let them think what they wanted. The memories were valuable, regardless of their perfect accuracy, and perhaps the Orkish perspective added something that pure human recordings would have lacked. Grazza grew old by Orc standards, eventually passing his tools to a younger mech boy with instructions to take good care of the Emperor's Git. The new mech boy, a surprisingly thoughtful Orc named Bracca, proved even more skilled than his predecessor. He made modifications to Thalric's systems that the ancient Dreadnought wouldn't have thought possible, integrating Orc and Imperial technology in ways that created entirely new capabilities. Gutslag remained warboss for decades, his power sustained by the prestige of having Thalric in his warband. When he finally fell in battle against a Tyrannid hive tyrant, his last words were instructions for his successor to protect the Emperor's Git. The new warboss, a massive Orc called Grimzog, honored that request, treating Thalric with the same respect that Gutslag had shown. The servo skull's encryption was eventually broken, revealing data from a fabricator general who had served during the Horus heresy. The information was returned to the Adeptus Mechanicus with Thalric's compliments, earning him a formal commendation from an organization that normally viewed all Xeno contact as unforgivable contamination. The commendation was carefully worded to avoid explicitly approving of his situation, while acknowledging the value of what he had preserved. Thalric realized, as decades became centuries, that he had achieved a kind of immortality different from mere survival. He had become a bridge between species, a living example that the galaxy's rigid categories might be more flexible than anyone wanted to admit. His existence challenged assumptions on both sides, proving to Orcs that not all humans were weak or boring, and proving to humans that not all xenocontact led to corruption. He still remembered the Emperor, still carried those precious memories that the Storm Wardens valued so highly. But now he understood the Emperor differently, through eyes that had seen reality from multiple perspectives. The golden figure in his recollections was still magnificent, still terrible in his power and wisdom. But Thalric now understood that there were other kinds of magnificence, other forms of power and wisdom that the Emperor might not have fully grasped. The Wagfield had taught him that belief shaped reality, that consciousness itself was a kind of force that could alter the fundamental nature of existence. This was not heretical knowledge. It was simply a truth that Imperial doctrine had not adequately addressed. The Emperor himself had understood it, had wielded his own consciousness as a weapon against the forces of chaos. But the Imperium he left behind had forgotten this lesson, replacing understanding with blind faith. Maybe, Thalric thought during his long periods of contemplation, that was his purpose. Not to fight eternal battles or preserve ancient memories, though he did both. His purpose was to remember what had been forgotten, to see what others refused to acknowledge, to exist as living proof that there were possibilities beyond the narrow paths that doctrine prescribed. He was the Emperor's Git, forever caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither but valued by both. And in that strange hybrid existence, he had found something approaching peace. The galaxy turned, stars died and were born, empires rose and fell. And through it all, on a dead world that had become strangely alive, an ancient Dreadnought stood vigil. He told stories to Orcs who listened with rapt attention, shared wisdom with tech priests who came seeking knowledge, and preserved memories of an age when the Emperor walked among mortals. He was compromise incarnate, the living embodiment of the idea that survival sometimes required abandoning principles and that honor could be found in unexpected places. His existence violated every rule, broke every precedent, and challenged every assumption about how the universe was supposed to work. And perhaps that was exactly what the 41st millennium needed, a reminder that rules could be broken, precedents could be set, and assumptions could be challenged. That faith without understanding was blindness, and that wisdom sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But in one small corner of that darkness, there was also understanding, cooperation, and the faint possibility that things might be different than they had always been. Thalric had seen the Emperor's true form, had gazed upon glory that mortals were not meant to witness, and he had learned, through his bizarre journey among the Orks, that there were other forms of glory, other kinds of truth, other ways of serving that transcended the narrow definitions of duty and honor. He would continue his vigil, continue his strange existence between worlds, continue to be the Emperor's Git for as long as consciousness endured. And somewhere, in whatever form the Emperor now existed, Thalric liked to think that the Master of Mankind looked upon this bizarre situation and found it acceptable, or perhaps, just perhaps, found it amusing. The Emperor had always appreciated a good surprise, after all, and Thalric's existence was certainly surprising. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what happens when Orks find a Dreadnought that saw the Emperor's true form, make sure to like and subscribe to Stories of Hammer for more Warhammer 40k content. We explore the strangest corners of the grimdark universe, asking the questions that others are too afraid to ask, and finding answers in places you'd never expect. The Emperor protects, and sometimes he does it in really weird ways.